Welcome to Lotus Whisper, Zen Tales for Sleep. Tonight, we will explore a simple yet profound path to freedom. It is a path that does not ask you to gain anything, but to release. We spend so much of our lives gathering, holding, and clinging to thoughts, memories, and worries, like stones collected in a bag we carry on our back. With each step, the weight grows, and we forget what it feels like to walk freely with an open heart and a quiet mind. But what if freedom is not found in adding more, but in letting go? Tonight, through ancient stories and quiet reflections, we will learn to gently open our hands. We will discover the deep peace that comes when we release the burdens we carry, allowing our minds to become as clear and calm as a still mountain lake. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. Part 1. The Parable of the Empty Boat. The river was a mirror of liquid silver, holding the last whispers of twilight. A fine mist, cool and soft as silk, rose from its surface, blurring the line between water and air, between the world and the reflection of the world. In a small wooden boat, a man sat alone. His name was Kenji, though on the river he was simply a fisherman, a silent observer in the slow, unfolding scroll of nature. The gentle current carried him, a steady and silent companion on his journey downstream. He was not fishing for anything to sell or even to eat. He was fishing for stillness. For many years, Kenji had lived a life of noise and hurry in the city. His mind had been a crowded marketplace filled with the shouts of ambition, the haggling of desire, and the constant, anxious counting of gains and losses. But a deep weariness had settled in his bones, a longing for a quiet that the city could never offer. And so he had sought the river. Here, the only sounds were the soft dip of his paddle in the water, the distant call of a night bird, and the gentle sigh of the wind through the reeds along the bank. He let his boat drift, his eyes half closed, feeling the rhythm of the water as if it were his own breath. The mist swirled around him, wrapping him in a cocoon of solitude. In this soft, gray world, there were no sharp edges, no hard lines. Everything flowed into everything else. The dark shapes of the trees on the shore were like ink smudges on wet paper. The moon, a pale disk behind the clouds, offered a diffused, gentle light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. This was the peace he sought, a state of being where he was not a man in a boat on a river, but simply a part of the river's own slow dream. He felt the tight knots of worry in his shoulders begin to loosen, the frantic pace of his thoughts begin to slow. Here, there was nothing to achieve, nothing to prove. There was only the boat, the water, and the quiet breathing of the world. He had been drifting for what felt like a timeless age when a subtle sound disturbed his reverie. It was a faint scraping, a gentle thud from ahead, somewhere in the thickest part of the mist. His eyes opened fully. He peered into the grey veil, his senses suddenly alert. The peace that had settled over him felt fragile now, a thin layer of ice over a restless current. Another boat was approaching. He could hear the faint splash of its passage through the water. A flicker of irritation sparked within him. This was his sanctuary, his place of solitude. The presence of another felt like an intrusion, a violation of the unspoken agreement he had with the river. Why did they have to be here, now? The river was wide. There was more than enough room for everyone. He gripped his paddle a little tighter, his knuckles white. The city had followed him here, it seemed, in the form of another person's carelessness. The other boat was coming closer. He could see its dark silhouette now, a shadow moving through the mist, heading directly for him. A surge of frustration rose in his chest. Was the person blind? Could they not see his small boat, a clear and present form on the water? He cleared his throat, preparing to call out, to shout a warning. But the words caught in his throat. A harder, hotter emotion was taking over. Anger. This was not just carelessness. This was disrespect. It was the same disregard he had felt in the city, where people pushed past each other without a glance, their minds so full of their own destinations that they were blind to everyone around them. This person, whoever they were, was bringing that same selfish energy to this sacred, quiet place. They were about to collide with him, to shatter his peace, and for what? For the sake of their own hurry, their own inattention. The collision was not violent, but it was jarring. A solid bump, a shudder that ran through the hull of his small boat, rocking it from side to side. The sound was dull and final. Kenji stumbled, catching himself on the side of the boat. The spell was broken. The stillness was gone, replaced by a raw, burning anger. His mind began to race, constructing a story, painting a portrait of the person in the other boat. It was probably some young fool from a nearby town, out for a joyride, with no respect for the old ways, for the quiet dignity of the river. Or perhaps it was a merchant, his mind so consumed with profits and schedules that he navigated the world with a brute force, expecting everything and everyone to get out of his way. Kenji could almost see him, a man with a hard face and impatient eyes. He stood up in his rocking boat, his body tense, his fists clenched. He was ready to shout. He would pour out all the frustration that had been building inside him. He would tell this person exactly what he thought of their recklessness, their intrusion, their complete lack of awareness. The words formed in his mind, sharp and pointed as arrows. He would make them feel the weight of their mistake. He would make them understand the peace they had destroyed. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with air to fuel his rage. He opened his mouth to shout, his eyes fixed on the dark shape of the other boat, which now sat motionless beside his own. The mist was beginning to thin, stirred by a faint breeze that rippled across the water. The moonlight grew a little stronger, casting a pale, ethereal glow on the scene. And in that moment of clearing light, Kenji saw. He saw the other boat clearly for the first time. It was a simple, weathered vessel, much like his own. Scratches and scuffs marked its sides, telling the stories of many journeys on the river. A fishing net was loosely coiled in its center, but there was no fisherman. There was no young fool. There was no impatient merchant. The boat was empty. It had simply broken free from its mooring upstream and had been carried down by the same silent current that had been guiding him. It was a ghost ship, a hollow form with no intention, no malice, no awareness at all. Kenji stood there, his mouth still open, the angry words dissolving on his tongue. A profound silence fell over him, deeper than the quiet of the river. It was the silence of a mind that has suddenly, utterly, run out of things to say. The anger, which had been a raging fire in his chest just a moment before, now had no fuel. It had been built entirely on the idea of someone to blame, a target for his frustration. But there was no one there. He stared at the empty boat. It floated peacefully beside him, a silent teacher. The anger did not just fade away. It collapsed. It was a house of cards built on a single false assumption, and when that card was removed, the entire structure fell to pieces, leaving nothing behind. He felt a strange sense of emptiness, but it was not a painful void. It was a clean, open space. Slowly, carefully, he sat back down. He looked at his own hands, which were still clenched into fists. He consciously uncurled his fingers, one by one. He felt the tension release from his jaw, from his shoulders, from his entire body. He took a long, slow breath, and as he exhaled, the last remnants of his rage seemed to flow out of him and dissolve into the mist. The river was the same. The moon was the same. The gentle rocking of the boat was the same. The only thing that had changed was the story in his mind. The event itself, the bump, had been neutral. It was a simple physical occurrence. A piece of wood had touched another piece of wood. All the suffering, all the anger, all the judgment had come from him. It was a storm he had created in the teacup of his own mind. He reached out and gave the empty boat a gentle push. It drifted away, turning slowly in the current, and was soon swallowed again by the mist. It left no wake, no trace of its passing, just as it had left no trace of malice. It had simply been what it was, an empty boat, moving with the flow. A deep sense of clarity washed over Kenji. He saw his own life reflected in that brief, intense moment of anger. How many times had he become enraged at an empty boat? How many times had a colleague's thoughtless comment, a stranger's hurried action, or an unexpected change of plans sent him into a spiral of frustration and blame? He had always looked for someone to hold responsible, someone to be the source of his disturbance. He had filled those empty boats with his own assumptions, his own fears, his own insecurities. He had imagined careless, disrespectful, or malicious people at the helm, and then he had raged at the phantoms of his own creation. The truth was, most of the things that disturb our peace are empty boats. They are events without intention. A delayed train is not a personal attack. A rainy day on a planned picnic is not a cosmic injustice. The person who cuts you off in traffic is likely not a villain, but someone lost in their own world of worry, just as you are. They are simply caught in their own currents, drifting through their own mist. The suffering does not come from the event. It comes from our insistence that the event should have been different, and from our desperate search for someone to blame. Kenji dipped his paddle into the water, the motion now slow and mindful. The small ripples spread out from his boat, perfect circles on the silver surface of the river. He felt a profound sense of freedom. It was not the freedom from other people, or from the world's disturbances. It was the freedom from his own reactions. The freedom that comes from realizing that you are the source of your own anger, and therefore, you are also the source of your own peace. You cannot control the currents of the river, and you cannot stop every empty boat from bumping into you. But you can choose not to fill them with imaginary enemies. You can choose to see them for what they are, empty. He looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted slightly, and a few stars were visible, glittering like scattered diamonds on dark velvet. The air was cool and clean against his skin. He felt a quiet joy rising within him, a gratitude for the silent lesson the river had just taught him. The empty boat had not shattered his peace. It had given him a deeper peace than he had ever known. It had shown him the way to the stillness he had been searching for, a stillness that did not depend on external conditions, but resided in the quiet center of his own being. He let his boat drift again, but this time, his solitude felt different. It was not a defense against the world, but an open embrace of it. He was a part of the flowing river, a part of the swirling mist, a part of the silent, watchful night. If another boat were to bump into him now, he thought, he would simply smile, give it a gentle push, and watch it drift away. There was no need for anger. There was no one to forgive, because there was nothing to blame. There was only the river flowing on, and the profound, unshakable peace of an empty mind in an empty boat, floating under the stars. And as he closed his eyes, he let the gentle current carry him, not toward any destination, but deeper into the calm, quiet heart of the present moment, a place of perfect rest. As he continued to drift, the world around him seemed to awaken in a new way. Before, the river's quiet was something he was trying to absorb, a commodity he was seeking. Now, he was a part of it. The quiet was not in the river, it was in him. He ran his hand along the worn, damp wood of his boat. He felt the grain, the slight roughness, the coolness of the water that had soaked into it. This small vessel was no longer just a tool to escape the world. It was his companion in understanding it. The soft lapping of water against the hull was not just a sound. It was a rhythm, a gentle, steady heartbeat that matched his own. His mind, now clear and spacious, wandered back to the life he had left behind, the life of noise and friction. A memory surfaced, one that had been a source of a dull, persistent ache for years. It was the memory of a promotion he had been denied at work. He had been certain it was his. He had worked tirelessly, sacrificing evenings and weekends, pouring his energy into the company. When the position was given to a younger colleague, a man named Sato, Kenji had been consumed by a bitter fire of injustice. In his mind, Sato was a calculating rival, and his managers were blind fools who had betrayed his loyalty. For months, even years, he had carried this story with him. It was a heavy, jagged stone in his heart. Every time he saw Sato in the hallways, the anger would flare anew. Every success, Sato had felt like a personal failure of his own. He had constructed an entire narrative of villains and victims, with himself at the center of the tragedy. Now, floating on the dark, still water, he saw that story for what it was: another empty boat. He had never truly known Sato's struggles, his ambitions, or the pressures he was under. He had never understood the complex decisions his managers had to make, the factors far beyond his own perspective. He had simply seen a boat coming toward him, a boat that seemed to block his path, and he had filled it with a malicious pilot of his own invention. He had raged against a phantom. What if Sato had simply been another person trying his best? What if his managers had made a difficult choice based on information he never had? What if the entire event was not a story about betrayal, but simply a neutral fact of life, a current in the river that had pushed him in a different direction? The direction that had, eventually, led him here, to this very moment of profound peace. A deep sigh escaped his lips, a sound that seemed to carry the last of that old bitterness with it. He felt the knot of resentment in his chest, a knot he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there, finally dissolve. It was like putting down a heavy bag he hadn't realized he was still carrying. The memory remained, its power to cause pain was gone. It was no longer a source of anger, but a lesson in perspective. It was just an empty boat, long since drifted past and disappeared into the mists of time. He realized then that letting go was not an act of forgetting. It was an act of seeing clearly. It was the wisdom to look at the colliding boats in our lives and have the patience to see if anyone is truly at the helm. More often than not, we find they are empty. They are driven by the winds of circumstance, the currents of another person's hidden suffering, or the simple, blind momentum of cause and effect. To rage against them is to shout at the wind. To find peace is to see the emptiness and simply, gently, push the boat away and continue on your own journey. This understanding spread through him, a quiet and comforting warmth. It was a key, and it unlocked countless doors in the cluttered rooms of his past. The friend who had grown distant, the neighbor whose loud music disturbed his sleep, the shopkeeper who had been rude to him one morning, all of them became empty boats. He had spent so much energy creating stories of blame and hurt, constructing elaborate reasons for his own unhappiness. Now, he could let them all go. He could release them from the roles he had assigned them in his dramas. And in releasing them, he released himself. He lay back in the boat, his head resting on a coil of rope. The sky above was a vast, dark ocean, and the stars were distant, silent lighthouses. He watched them, not with the mind of an astronomer who names and categorizes, but with the simple wonder of a child. They were just lights, beautiful and mysterious. They asked for nothing. They offered no explanation. They simply were. Like the river, like the mist, like the empty boat. The gentle rocking of his own small boat became a cradle. The cool night air was a soft blanket. The sound of the water was a lullaby. He was no longer Kenji, the man who had come to the river seeking peace. He was just a part of the night's deep breathing. The anxiety that had once tightened his chest had given way to a vast and open stillness. The need to control, to understand, to blame, had been replaced by a simple, trusting acceptance. He was floating in the gentle, powerful current of life itself, and he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that it would carry him exactly where he needed to go. There was nothing to fight, nothing to hold on to. There was only the journey, and in that deep, quiet surrender, he felt the first soft waves of sleep begin to wash over him, carrying him toward a shore of perfect rest. Part 2. Carrying the woman across the river. The path was a ribbon of mud, a memory of the storm that had passed the night before. It clung to the sandals of the two monks, making each step a small, soft sound of release, a sigh from the wet earth. They walked in silence, as they often did. The world after a rain has its own language, and they were content to listen. The air was clean and cool, carrying the scent of damp soil, pine needles, and the sweet decay of fallen leaves. Droplets of water clung to the tips of ferns like tiny jewels, catching the pale morning light. The two monks were Tanzan and Aikido. Though they wore the same simple robes and walked the same path, they moved through the world in very different ways. Tanzan, the elder, walked with a light and easy stride. His eyes were open to everything around him, the way a spider's web, heavy with rain, sagged between two branches, the determined progress of an ant carrying a crumb of food, the shifting patterns of clouds in the sky. His presence was like that of a deep, calm lake, reflecting everything without being disturbed by it. He was in the world, and the world was in him. Aikido, the younger monk, walked with a different kind of energy. His steps were precise, his gaze often directed downward at the path ahead. His mind was a well-ordered garden, and he was its diligent keeper, constantly pulling the weeds of improper thoughts and reinforcing the neat rows of the sacred precepts. He carried the teachings not just in his heart, but on his shoulders, a weight of responsibility that made him careful, serious, and perpetually vigilant. He loved the path of Zen, but for him it was a narrow path, and he was always afraid of stumbling. Their journey was taking them to a distant monastery for a gathering of teachers. The road was long and, on this day, particularly treacherous. The morning's quiet walk gave way to the afternoon's challenge, a river, swollen and brown from the storm's deluge. It was no longer a gentle stream, but a rushing, formidable torrent. There was no bridge. The usual crossing, a line of smooth, flat stones, was completely submerged beneath the churning water. As they stood on the bank, contemplating their next move, they saw they were not alone. A short distance away, a young woman stood, her distress as plain as the fine silk of her kimono. She was dressed for a wedding or a festival, her clothes a vibrant splash of color against the muted greens and browns of the landscape. But her finery was now her prison. The mud had stained the hem of her kimono, and the river before her was an impossible barrier. She paced back and forth, her beautiful face etched with worry, looking at the rushing water and then at her delicate slippers. Aikido saw her and immediately averted his gaze, a faint blush rising on his cheeks. He took a half-step back, as if her presence were a flame too bright for him. The precepts were clear. A monk should not approach a woman, especially a young and beautiful one. They were to guard their senses, to keep their minds pure and untroubled by the distractions of the world. He began to recite the rules silently to himself, reinforcing the walls of his inner garden. He felt a sense of pity for the woman's predicament, but it was a distant, detached pity, filtered through the thick screen of his vows. Tanzan, however, simply observed. He saw the situation not as a test of his vows, but as a simple reality. Here was a person in need. The river was high. She could not cross. The equation was simple, and the answer, for him, was just as simple. Without a word, he walked toward her. The young woman looked up, startled, as the tall monk in his plain brown robe approached. She took a step back, uncertain. Aikido watched from a distance, his heart beginning to pound with a mixture of shock and disapproval. What was Tanzan doing? He was walking directly toward temptation, toward a clear violation of their sacred code. Tanzan stopped before the woman and gave her a gentle, reassuring smile. He did not speak. He simply bent down, and in one smooth, effortless motion, he lifted her into his arms. The woman gave a small gasp of surprise, but she did not struggle. She seemed to understand the pure, uncomplicated nature of the act. Tanzan held her as one might hold a child or a precious vase, with a kind of impersonal care. He turned and strode into the river. The cold water swirled around his legs, strong and insistent, but his steps were steady and sure. He navigated the hidden stones with a practiced ease, his focus entirely on the task at hand, getting this person safely to the other side. Aikido watched, frozen on the bank, his mind a whirlwind of outrage. He could see the vibrant silk of the woman's kimono pressed against Tanzan's plain robe, He could see her arm resting on Tanzan's shoulder. Every precept he had ever memorized screamed in his mind. This was wrong. This was a defilement. Tanzan, his elder, his teacher, was breaking the rules with such casual indifference. How could he? When Tanzan reached the far bank, he gently set the woman down on dry ground. She bowed deeply, her face filled with a silent, profound gratitude. Tanzan simply nodded in return, then turned and waded back through the rushing water to where Aikido was standing. He arrived, his robes dripping, and looked at his young companion. "Well," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "Shall we continue?" Aikido could not speak. He was choked with a storm of conflicting emotions. He wanted to shout, to demand an explanation. But his respect for his elder and his own inner turmoil kept him silent. He gave a stiff, formal bow and followed Tanzan, who had already started walking again as if nothing at all had happened. And so they walked on. The path began to climb, leaving the river valley behind. The mud gave way to firmer ground, and the sun, now higher in the sky, began to warm the air. But for Aikido, the world had lost its beauty. He no longer saw the light filtering through the leaves or heard the song of the birds. His inner world was filled with the image of Tanzan carrying the woman. He replayed the scene again and again in his mind. The touch, the proximity, the breaking of the vow. Each time he saw it, his indignation grew. He felt a sense of betrayal. Tanzan was supposed to be a model of discipline, a living embodiment of the teachings. What he had done was a stain not just on himself, but on their tradition. And why? For a woman he didn't even know. He had risked his purity, his spiritual progress, for a fleeting moment of convenience for a stranger. Aikido felt a sense of righteous anger. He, at least, had upheld the precepts. He had remained pure. He was the better monk, he thought. And the thought gave him a small, sour satisfaction that quickly curdled into more confusion. They walked for an hour. The silence between them was no longer the peaceful, companionable silence of the morning. It was a heavy, charged silence, thick with Aikido's unspoken accusations. Tanzan seemed completely unaffected. He walked with the same easy grace, occasionally pointing out a distant mountain peak or an interesting cloud formation. His peace was infuriating to Aikido. How could he be so calm? Did he not realize the gravity of his transgression? They walked for 2 hours. Aikido's mind was a courtroom. He was the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. He presented the evidence, the beautiful woman, the broken rule, the physical contact. He cross-examined Tanzan in his imagination, asking him sharp, pointed questions. He found him guilty again and again. The sentence was a heavy weight of disapproval that Aikido himself had to carry. His shoulders ached with the tension. His jaw was tight. He was physically burdened by his own judgment. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent toward the western hills. The shadows of the trees grew long across the path. They had walked for miles. They had passed through small villages, crossed over rolling hills, and walked through quiet bamboo groves where the wind whispered secrets. And through it all, Aikido carried the woman. Tanzan had carried her for a few moments, for the 50 or so feet it took to cross a river. Aikido had been carrying her in his mind for hours, for miles. She was heavier now than she had ever been in Tanzan's arms.
She was weighted down with his judgment, his anger, his confusion. She was a ghost who walked beside him, a constant reminder of his elder's failure. Finally, as they approached the gates of the monastery where they were to spend the night, Aikido could bear it no longer. The pressure of his unspoken thoughts had become a physical pain. He had to speak. He had to release the poison of his judgment. He stopped, forcing Tanzan to stop as well, and turned to face him. "Tanzan," Aikido said, his voice tight and strained. "I must speak." Tanzan looked at him with his clear, calm eyes. "Of course, Aikido. What is on your mind?" "Back at the river," Aikido began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The woman. You know the precepts as well as I do. We monks do not go near females. We do not touch them. It is dangerous for our practice.
It clouds the mind." He took a breath, his chest heaving. "Why did you do that? Why did you break your vows and carry her across the river?" Tanzan looked at Aikido, and for the first time that day, a faint, compassionate smile touched his lips. He did not look defensive or ashamed. He looked as if he were explaining something very simple to a child who was having trouble with the lesson. He said, very gently, "I left the girl there, on the other side of the river, hours ago." He paused, letting the words settle in the quiet evening air. Then he asked, with genuine curiosity, "Are you still carrying her?" The question struck Aikido with the force of a physical blow. He stared at Tanzan, his mouth slightly open. The courtroom in his mind fell silent. The judge, the prosecutor, the jury, they all vanished. In their place was a vast, echoing emptiness. "Are you still carrying her?" The truth of the question illuminated everything. He saw it all in a flash of painful, liberating clarity. Tanzan had performed a simple act of compassion in the present moment, and then had let it go completely. The event was finished, over, left behind on the riverbank. But Aikido had picked it up. He had clung to it, nurtured it with his anger, polished it with his judgment, and carried it with him every step of the way. The burden was not the act itself, but his memory of it, his story about it. He felt a wave of shame, followed by an immense sense of relief. The heavy ghost he had been carrying for miles simply dissolved into nothing. He felt the tension release from his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw soften. He could suddenly feel the cool evening breeze on his face. He could hear the chirping of crickets in the grass. The world, which had been gray and muted by his inner turmoil, rushed back in, full of color and life. He looked at Tanzan, at his calm, kind face, and for the first time, he understood the difference between them. Aikido followed the rules. Tanzan followed the path. Aikido was trying to protect his purity by building walls. Tanzan lived in a state of purity that needed no protection because it was open, compassionate, and free. Letting go. It was not about forgetting. It was about not clinging. It was about allowing each moment to be born and to die, without trying to hold on to it, judge it, or force it to fit a preconceived rule. The river flows. The rain falls. A person needs help. And then the moment passes. To carry it forward is to choose to live in a prison of your own making. To let it go is to walk freely on the path. Aikido bowed deeply to his teacher, a bow not of mere formality, but of profound, heartfelt gratitude.
He had been shown the heaviest burden of all is the one we refuse to set down. As they walked the final few steps toward the monastery gate, Aikido felt lighter than he had in years. He was no longer carrying the woman. He was no longer carrying his judgment. He was carrying only himself in the simple,
Uncomplicated peace of the present moment, ready for a night of deep and untroubled rest. That night, Aikido could not sleep. But for the first time in a long while, his wakefulness was not a state of anxious restlessness, but one of quiet, vibrant clarity. He lay on his simple straw mat, listening to the gentle sounds of the monastery around him, the distant, rhythmic chanting from the main hall, the soft rustle of the wind in the ancient ginkgo tree outside his window, the slow, even breathing of the other monks in the dormitory. Before, these sounds might have been distractions, imperfections in the silence he sought. Tonight, they were simply part of the fabric of the moment, each sound a thread in a beautiful, living tapestry. His mind, usually a turbulent sea of planning, worrying, and self-critique, was as still and clear as a mountain pond at midnight. Tanzen's question echoed within this newfound stillness, not as an accusation, but as a gentle, resonant bell. Are you still carrying her? He realized the woman by the river was just one of many things he had been carrying. He was carrying the memory of every mistake he had ever made in his practice, every time he had felt his concentration waver during meditation. He was carrying the words of a teacher from his childhood who had told him he was not disciplined enough. He was carrying the fear of failing to live up to the ideal of a perfect monk, an ideal he himself had constructed from scriptures and stories. His life had become a long, arduous journey with a heavy pack on his back, filled with the stones of yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's anxieties. He had been so focused on the weight, on managing the contents of the pack, that he had forgotten to look at the path itself, to feel the earth beneath his feet. Tanzen, he now understood, walked with empty hands. He met each moment as it arose, with an open heart and a clear mind. He dealt with what was right in front of him, a swollen river, a person in need, and then he moved on, unburdened. His compassion was not a calculated act, weighed against a set of rules. It was a natural, spontaneous response, like a flower turning toward the sun. It was the expression of a mind that was not cluttered with the past. Aikido thought about the precepts, the rules he had held so tightly. He had seen them as a rigid cage designed to keep the world out, to protect him from impurity. Now he began to see them in a different light. Perhaps they were not meant to be a cage, but a trellis. Not a wall to hide behind, but a support structure to help a young plant grow straight and strong. Once the plant was mature, once its trunk was sturdy and its roots were deep, it no longer needed the trellis in the same way. It could stand on its own, reaching for the sky, flexible enough to bend in the wind without breaking. Tanzen was like that mature tree. His morality was not a matter of external rules, but of an inner compass, a deep, intuitive understanding that naturally pointed toward kindness and wisdom. He had not broken the precepts. He had transcended them. He had acted from a place of such profound emptiness and compassion that the dualistic concepts of pure and impure simply did not apply. He had seen a human being in need of help, and he had helped. The story, the complications, the judgments, all of that was added later by Aikido's own mind. A feeling of deep humility washed over Aikido. He had been so proud of his discipline, so certain of his own righteousness. He had looked at Tanzan's freedom and mistaken it for carelessness. He had judged his elder from a place of profound ignorance. The true practice, he was beginning to see, was not about accumulating merit or perfecting a disciplined self. It was about dissolving the self, letting go of the rigid identity of the good monk and simply being present, open, and responsive to life as it is. He rose from his mat and walked silently to the window. The moon was full, casting a brilliant silver light over the monastery's courtyard. The ginkgo tree stood in the center, its fan-shaped leaves looking like 1,000 tiny, illuminated hands. He watched as a single leaf detached itself from a branch. It did not struggle. It did not cling. It simply let go and drifted down on the gentle air, turning and dancing in the moonlight until it came to rest on the mossy ground below. That leaf, he thought, was the perfect teacher. Its entire existence was a lesson in letting go. It held on while it was time to hold on, drawing life from the sun and the rain. And when its time was over, it released its grip without a moment's hesitation, surrendering itself back to the earth from which it came. There was no regret, no fear, only a simple, graceful acceptance of the flow of things. A deep peace settled in Akito's heart. He felt a sense of release so profound it was almost physical. He let go of the woman. He let go of his pride. He let go of his fear. He let go of the monk he was trying to be. And for the first time, simply allowed himself to be the man who was standing at a window, watching a single leaf fall in the moonlight. And in that simple, unburdened moment, he found the rest he had been seeking all along. He returned to his mat, and as he lay down, sleep came to him easily, a soft and welcome tide, carrying him into a dreamless, peaceful dark. Part 3. A Cup of Tea. Professor Kenjiro was a man who lived in a house made of words. Its walls were built from books, its windows were framed with theories, and its roof was tiled with quotations from the great philosophers of the East and West. He was a celebrated scholar of religion and philosophy at the Imperial University, a man whose lectures were so dense with information and brilliant analysis that students would leave the hall feeling both intellectually dazzled and strangely empty. His mind was a magnificent, overflowing library. He could trace the subtle threads connecting the Upanishads to German idealism. He could debate the nuances of Taoist metaphysics, and he could recite long passages from the Diamond Sutra from memory. He had studied Zen for 2 decades, reading every text, every commentary, every scholarly article he could find. He knew the history of its patriarchs, the classification of its koans, and the philosophical implications of its core tenets. He knew everything about Zen. But a quiet, persistent unease had begun to grow in the silent corners of his heart. It was a feeling he could not name, a subtle sense of thirst in the midst of an ocean of knowledge. For all his understanding, peace was a concept he studied, not a state he inhabited. His mind was in constant motion, a tireless engine of analysis and comparison. When he looked at a flower, he did not simply see a flower. He saw a symbol of impermanence, a biological specimen to be classified, a subject of poetry he could recall. The direct, simple experience of the flower itself was lost in the cloud of his own thoughts about it. He was a man drowning in the very water he was trying to describe. He had heard tales of a Zen master named Jinsei, who lived in a small temple in the mountains, a few days' journey from the capital. Jinsei had written no books and gave no lectures. His wisdom was said to be not in what he said, but in what he was. People spoke of a profound stillness that surrounded him, a clarity that could quiet even the most troubled minds. Kenjiro, with the intellectual arrogance that was his constant companion, decided he would visit this master. He would go and have a discussion, a meeting of two great minds. He would demonstrate his own deep understanding of Zen, and perhaps, in the process, add the master's personal insights to his own vast collection of knowledge. The journey itself was a study in contrasts. He left the city, a place of sharp angles, loud noises, and purposeful hurry. As the path led him higher into the mountains, the world began to soften. The air grew cooler and smelled of pine and damp earth. The sounds of the city were replaced by the whisper of the wind through bamboo groves and the call of unseen birds. Yet Kenjiro's mind remained a bustling city. He rehearsed the philosophical points he would make to the master. He formulated complex questions designed to showcase his erudition. He was not walking through the mountains. He was walking through his own thoughts, the landscape merely a backdrop for his inner monologue. He arrived at the temple in the late afternoon. It was not a grand structure, but a collection of simple, weathered wooden buildings that seemed to have grown organically from the mountainside. An old monk, with a face as serene as a sleeping child, was sweeping fallen leaves in the courtyard. He moved with a slow, rhythmic grace, each sweep of his broom a perfect, mindful act. Kenjiro, feeling impatient, announced his purpose with a certain air of importance. The old monk simply smiled, bowed, and led him without a word to a small hut set apart from the main buildings. The room was bare, save for a few tatami mats on the floor, a simple iron kettle over a charcoal brazier, and a single stalk of iris in a bamboo vase. The simplicity was so profound it felt almost aggressive to Kenjiro, a stark rebuke to his own cluttered mind. Master Jinsei sat in the center of the room. He was an old man, but his posture was straight, and his eyes were as clear and bright as a young boy's. They held a depth that seemed to see right through Kenjiro's carefully constructed intellectual facade. Kenjiro bowed stiffly, as was custom, and began to speak. He did not ask a question. He began to explain. He spoke of his years of research, of the books he had read, of the conclusions he had drawn. He talked about the concept of emptiness, sunyata, comparing it to the nihilistic philosophies of the West. He spoke of satori, enlightenment, and offered his own theories on the neurological processes that might underlie such an experience. He was a fountain of words, a torrent of concepts, filling the small, quiet room with the noise of his mind. Master Jinsei listened. He did not nod or frown. He did not interrupt. He simply sat, his presence a basin of perfect stillness, receiving the flood of Kenjiro's words without a single ripple. His silence was unnerving. Kenjiro, accustomed to the parry and thrust of academic debate, felt as if he were fighting a ghost. The more the master remained silent, the more Kenjiro felt compelled to talk, to fill the vast, empty space that the master's presence created. He spoke for what felt like an hour, his voice growing hoarse, his initial confidence slowly eroding into a kind of desperation. Finally, his stream of words slowed to a trickle, and then stopped. He was exhausted, his mind drained. The silence that followed was immense. In that silence, Kenjiro felt, for the first time, the full weight of his own mental clutter. Master Jinsei finally stirred. A gentle smile touched his lips. "You have come a long way," he said, his voice soft but clear, like the sound of a small bell. "You must be thirsty. Let us have some tea." Relieved by the shift, Kenjiro nodded eagerly. The master moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. Every action was simple, direct, and complete in itself. He cleaned the tea bowl, he measured the green powder, he ladled the hot water from the kettle. There was no wasted motion, no hint of distraction. He was not making tea, he was simply being in the act of preparing it. Kenjiro watched, fascinated, his analytical mind trying to deconstruct the master's movements, to find the secret to his profound calm. The master placed a beautiful rustic tea bowl in front of the professor. Kenjiro held it in his hands, admiring its imperfect shape, the subtle texture of its glaze. "Master." Jinsei picked up the teapot and began to pour the steaming, fragrant tea into Kenjiro's bowl. The rich, green liquid rose, filling the bowl almost to the brim. Kenjiro watched, anticipating the moment the master would stop. But he did not. He continued to pour. The tea reached the lip of the bowl, and then, in a silent, green cascade, it began to overflow. It ran down the side of the bowl, pooling in the saucer beneath. The saucer filled, and still the master poured. The hot tea spilled over the edge of the saucer onto the small, lacquered tray. The tray filled, and still he poured. A stream of tea began to run off the tray and onto the clean tatami mat, staining its pale straw with a dark, spreading wetness. Kenjiro stared, first in confusion, then in alarm. This was a breach of all etiquette, a senseless, wasteful act. He could no longer contain himself. "Stop!" he cried out, pulling the bowl away. "It is overfull. No more will go in." Master Jinsei stopped pouring. He set down the teapot and looked at Kenjiro, his bright, clear eyes holding no apology, only a gentle, unwavering attention. "Like this cup," the master said, his voice quiet but resonant in the still room. "You are full of your own opinions and speculations. You come and ask me to teach you of Zen, but your mind is already overflowing. How can I show you anything unless you first empty your cup?" The words landed not in Kenjiro's mind, but in his heart. They were not a philosophical concept to be analyzed, but a direct, undeniable truth he could feel in his bones. He looked at the mess on the tray, the spilled tea, the stained mat. It was a perfect, undeniable reflection of his own inner state. He'd come to the master not to receive, but to show how much he already contained. He'd been so busy talking, so busy demonstrating his knowledge, that he'd left no room to listen, no space to learn. A profound sense of shame washed over him, but it was a cleansing shame, not a destructive one. It burned away the fog of his intellectual pride, leaving him feeling raw, exposed, and for the first time in a very long time, humble. He looked at the master, and for the first time, he was not seeing a subject for his research, but a wise man who had just shown him the truth of his own condition with a simple, compassionate, and unforgettable act. He did not know what to say. The words that had been his constant companions, his tools and his armor, had all deserted him. He simply sat in silence, looking at the overflowing cup. The master did not offer any further explanation. He did not tell Kenjiro how to empty his cup. The lesson was in the seeing, not in the instruction. He simply picked up a cloth and began to mindfully, patiently, wipe up the spilled tea. Each wipe of the cloth was like a gentle erasure of Kenjiro's own pride. Kenjiro left the mountain temple a different man. He had arrived with a mind full of answers, and he was leaving with a single, essential question. How do I empty my cup? The journey back was not filled with mental rehearsals or philosophical debates. He walked in silence. He noticed, for the first time, the precise shape of the pine needles on the path. He felt the coolness of the breeze on his skin. He heard the melody in a bird's song without trying to name the bird. He was beginning, just beginning, to experience the world directly, without the thick filter of his own thoughts. That night, back in his study, surrounded by the thousands of books that had once been his pride, he did not open a single one. He saw them now not as a treasure, but as a great weight. Each book was a full cup offered by another. He had spent his life collecting the full cups of others without ever realizing his own was overflowing. He sat on a simple cushion in the middle of the room, closed his eyes, and for the first time, he did not try to think. He did not try to meditate or achieve some special state. He simply sat, listening to the sound of his own breathing, content to be empty, waiting, with a newfound patience, for the simple, quiet truth of the moment to pour in. And in that quiet, empty space, a deep and profound relaxation spread through him, preparing him for a sleep more restful than any he had ever known. The days that followed were a quiet revolution. Kenjiro did not abandon his books, but his relationship with them changed. He no longer approached them as a conqueror, seeking to extract and possess their knowledge. Instead, he would pick up a single volume, perhaps a collection of poems by Ryokan, or the simple, direct teachings of Bankai, and read a single passage. Then he would close the book, set it aside, and let the words dissolve into the silence of his own experience. He was learning to taste the tea, not just analyze its chemical composition. His lectures at the university began to change as well. At first, his students were confused. The brilliant, rapid-fire delivery of complex information was gone. In its place was a slower, more spacious way of speaking. He would often pause for long moments, letting a single idea hang in the air, giving it room to breathe. He started asking questions instead of only providing answers. "What does this feel like to you?" he would ask after reading a passage. "Where do you find this in your own life?" Some students, hungry for the kind of intellectual certainty he had once provided, grew impatient and stopped coming. But others, the ones who had always felt that something was missing from his dazzling displays of erudition, found themselves drawn in. They began to speak, to share their own experiences, their own uncertainties. The lecture hall, once a theater for a one-man performance, slowly transformed into a shared space of inquiry, a place where knowledge was not just transmitted, but awakened. Kenjiro was learning that an empty cup was not only a prerequisite for his own learning, but also for his teaching. By emptying himself of the need to be the expert, he created a space where his students could begin to find their own wisdom. The greatest change, however, occurred not in his study or the lecture hall, but within the quiet landscape of his own mind. He began a practice of simply sitting, every morning and every evening. He did not call it meditation, for that word itself was a cupful of expectations and techniques. He simply called it sitting. He would sit on his cushion and allow the contents of his mind to arise without judgment. At first, it was a torrent, a chaotic flood of thoughts, plans, memories, and arguments, much like the stream of words he had unleashed upon Master Jinsei. His instinct, honed by years of intellectual discipline, was to grab onto these thoughts, to organize them, analyze them, and wrestle them into submission. But the image of the overflowing teacup would always return to him. He would see the master's calm face, hear his gentle words, and he would practice letting go. He learned to watch his thoughts as if they were clouds passing in the sky. A dark cloud of worry would appear on the horizon of his awareness. Instead of becoming the cloud, of getting lost in its story, he would simply note its presence. Ah, worry. He would observe its shape, its texture, its movement, and then watch as, inevitably, it drifted on and dissolved back into the vast blue sky of his mind. A bright, fluffy cloud of a pleasant memory would float by. He would acknowledge it with a gentle inner smile, a happy memory, and then let it go too, without clinging to it or trying to make it stay. This was the hardest work he had ever done, far harder than deciphering an ancient text or constructing a complex philosophical argument. It was the work of non-doing, of unlearning, of becoming empty. There were days of profound frustration when his mind felt like a raging storm he could not possibly quiet. On those days, he would be tempted to give up, to return to the familiar comfort of his books and his theories. But the memory of the master's peace, the feeling of profound stillness in that simple mountain hut, was a powerful anchor. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that the path to that peace was not through adding more, but through letting go. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, moments of true silence began to appear. At first, they were just tiny gaps between the clouds of thought, fleeting instants of pure, unmediated awareness. But over time, these gaps began to widen. He discovered a quiet space within himself, a background of stillness that was always present, even amidst the noise of his thoughts. It was like discovering a deep, silent ocean beneath the turbulent waves on the surface. In this newfound stillness, the world began to reveal itself to him in a new way. The taste of his morning rice, the warmth of the sun on his face as he walked to the university, the sound of rain on the roof. These simple, ordinary experiences became profound and deeply satisfying. He had been living his life through a thick pane of glass, the glass of his own concepts and ideas. Now, it felt as if that glass were slowly dissolving, allowing him to touch the world directly for the first time. One afternoon, months after his visit to the mountain, he was sitting in his garden. He was not thinking, not analyzing, simply watching a single camellia blossom, a perfect splash of crimson against the dark green leaves. He observed the delicate curve of its petals, the fine, golden dust of the pollen at its center. He was so completely absorbed in the simple act of seeing that the boundary between himself and the flower seemed to fade. There was no Kenjiro looking at a flower. There was only seeing. There was only the vibrant, silent, living presence of the moment. In that instant, he understood. He understood what all the books had been pointing to, what all the philosophies had tried to describe. It was not a concept. It was not a theory. It was this simple, direct, unadorned reality. The cup was empty, and the universe had poured itself in. A quiet joy, so deep and pure it brought tears to his eyes, welled up within him. It was not the proud, triumphant joy of intellectual discovery, but the humble, grateful joy of coming home. He sat there for a long time as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. He knew his journey was far from over, that the cup of the mind is easily filled again with the debris of daily life. But now he knew the way. The way was not to seek more knowledge, but to cultivate more emptiness. The way was not to become someone who knew everything, but to become no one, an empty vessel, ready and open to receive the simple, profound, and ever-present gift of what is. And with that understanding, a deep, restful peace settled over him, a peace that promised a sleep as deep and clear as an empty cup. Part 4. The Farmer and His Horse. In a small village nestled in a valley where the mountains seemed to touch the sky, lived an old farmer. His name was Wei, though most people in the village simply called him the Old Man. His face was a map of his life, etched with the deep lines of sun and wind, sorrow and laughter. His hands were gnarled and strong, shaped by a lifetime of working the earth. He lived in a simple hut with his only son, and his most prized possession was a single, strong horse. The horse was more than just an animal. It was the farmer's partner. It helped him plow the terraced fields that clung to the mountainside. It carried his harvest to the village market, and in the quiet evenings, it would stand patiently in its small paddock, its presence a calm and steady comfort. The horse was a fine animal, with a coat the color of polished chestnut and eyes that were dark and intelligent. The other villagers often remarked on Wei's good fortune to have such a creature. One morning, the farmer's son went to the paddock to feed the horse, but the gate was swinging open on its wooden hinge, and the horse was gone. The boy ran back to the hut, his face pale with panic. "Father, the horse! It has run away!" News traveled quickly in a village so small. Soon, Wei's neighbors gathered at his gate, their faces full of concern and pity. "Oh, what terrible luck," said the baker, shaking his head. "That horse was worth a fortune. How will you manage the plowing now?" "This is a disaster," added the weaver. "Such a great misfortune has befallen you. We are so sorry for your loss." They offered their condolences, their voices a chorus of sympathy for his bad luck. The old farmer listened to them all, his expression calm and unreadable. He looked at the empty paddock, at the worried faces of his friends, and then at the distant mountains where his horse had disappeared. After a long silence, he simply said, "Maybe." The villagers were taken aback by his strange response. "Maybe?" they whispered to each other as they walked away. "What does he mean, maybe? It is clearly a terrible thing. The old man must be so overcome with grief that his mind is confused." They left, shaking their heads, convinced that Wei was in denial of his great misfortune. For the next week, the farmer and his son worked the fields by hand. The work was slow and back-breaking. They pulled the plow themselves, their shoulders straining, their muscles aching. The son, young and full of fire, complained bitterly about their bad luck. "If only that horse hadn't run away," he would say, wiping the sweat from his brow. "This is the worst thing that could have happened to us." The old farmer would just nod and continue his work, his breath steady, his movements deliberate. He did not speak of the horse. He did not complain about the hardship. He simply did what needed to be done each day, tending the soil, planting the seeds, living his life. Then, one evening, just as the sun was setting behind the highest peak, they heard a familiar sound. It was the thunder of hoofbeats. They looked up, and there, coming down the mountain path, was their horse. And it was not alone. Following behind it was a magnificent herd of wild horses, their manes flying in the wind, their bodies sleek and powerful. The farmer's horse had not just returned, it had brought with it a dozen new companions. The villagers heard the commotion and came running. Their eyes grew wide with amazement. One horse had been a treasure. A whole herd was a miracle. They crowded around the old farmer, their voices now full of excitement and envy. "What incredible luck!" the baker exclaimed, his face beaming. "You have gone from having nothing to being the richest man in the valley. This is a true blessing from the heavens." "Such a wonderful fortune," cried the weaver, "to lose one horse and gain so many. You are a man favored by destiny." They slapped him on the back, congratulating him on his amazing good fortune. The old farmer stood quietly, watching as his son skillfully guided the wild horses into the now crowded paddock. He looked at the beautiful, untamed animals, at the joyful faces of his neighbors, and at the sky, now painted with the soft colors of twilight. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice as calm and even as before. "Maybe," he said. The villagers were once again bewildered. "Maybe?" they muttered as they dispersed. "The man is strange. First, he is not sad when he has bad luck, and now he is not happy when he has good luck. It is impossible to understand him." The farmer's son, however, was overjoyed. He was a skilled rider, and he immediately began the patient work of taming the wild horses. It was his passion, his gift. He spent every waking hour with the animals, speaking to them in a low, soothing voice, slowly earning their trust. He dreamed of the fine horses he would sell, of the prosperity they would bring to his family. One afternoon, he was working with a particularly spirited young stallion. The horse was proud and powerful, and the boy was determined to be the one to ride it first. He managed to get a saddle on its back, and, with a leap of youthful confidence, he swung himself up. For a moment, he sat tall, a conqueror. But the stallion would not be so easily tamed. It bucked violently, a twisting, explosive movement of pure, wild energy. The boy was thrown into the air and landed hard on the rocky ground. There was a sharp, cracking sound, and a searing pain shot through his leg. The old farmer rushed to his side. The boy's leg was broken, twisted at an unnatural angle. Wei, with a gentle strength, splinted the leg as best he could and carried his son back to the hut. The village healer was summoned. He examined the leg and shook his head gravely. The break was bad. The boy would be unable to walk for many months. He would be lucky if he did not limp for the rest of his life. Once again, the neighbors came to offer their sympathies. Their faces were grim. "Oh, what a terrible, terrible thing," the baker said, his voice low. "First, the blessing of the horses, and now this curse. Your son, so young and strong, now crippled." "It would have been better if those wild horses had never come," the weaver added, dabbing her eyes with a cloth. "They brought you nothing but sorrow. This is the worst luck of all." They looked at the old farmer, expecting to see him crushed by this latest tragedy. His only son, his hope for the future, was now injured, perhaps permanently. But Wei's face was a mask of calm acceptance. He sat by his son's bedside, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth. He listened to the villagers' laments, and when they had finished, he looked at them and said, his voice soft and steady, "Maybe." And so, life went on. The son lay in his bed, his leg bound in splints, his spirit frustrated and sullen. The wild horses remained in the paddock, a constant, untamed reminder of the accident. The old farmer tended to his son and his fields, his routine unchanged. A few weeks later, a new sound echoed through the valley. It was not the sound of hoofbeats, but the sound of drums and marching feet. A troop of soldiers from the imperial army marched into the village. A war had broken out in a distant province, and the emperor had issued a decree. All able-bodied young men were to be conscripted and sent to the front lines. The soldiers went from house to house, their faces hard and impersonal. The baker's son was taken. The weaver's son was taken. Every family in the village with a healthy young man was forced to say a tearful, desperate goodbye. The sorrow in the village was a thick, heavy blanket. Everyone knew that the war was brutal and that most of the young men who were taken would never return. The soldiers came to the old farmer's hut. They strode in, their armor clanking, and looked at the farmer's son lying in his bed, his broken leg propped up on a pillow. The commanding officer glanced at the injury, grunted in disdain, and turned to leave. "This one is useless to us," he said, and they marched out, leaving the farmer and his son alone. That evening, the village was silent, a place of quiet grief. The houses that had once been full of the laughter of young men were now filled with the sound of weeping. The neighbors, their own sons now gone, made their way to the old farmer's hut. This time, they did not come to offer pity or congratulations. They came in a kind of awe. "Your son was spared," the baker said, his voice thick with a mixture of relief for his friend and sorrow for his own loss. "His broken leg, it was not a curse, it was a blessing. It saved his life. You have such incredible good fortune." "We thought you had the worst of luck," said the weaver, her eyes red from crying. "But it turns out you had the best. Your son is safe with you." They all looked at the old farmer, who was sitting in the doorway, watching the last light fade from the sky. They waited for his response, for some acknowledgement of this final, miraculous turn of fate. The old man drew a long breath, smelling the scent of the cool night air. He looked at the faces of his friends, faces filled with the pain of their own loss and the wonder at his strange destiny. He smiled a small, gentle smile, and for the last time he said, "Maybe." The story of the farmer and his horse became a quiet legend in the valley. It was a lesson whispered from one generation to the next. Life is a river, constantly flowing, constantly changing. We stand on the bank and try to label the currents as good or bad, but we see only a tiny part of the river's journey. The event that seems like a disaster today may be the seed of a great blessing tomorrow. The triumph that fills our hearts with pride may be the first step toward a future sorrow. To let go of judgment is to find a profound and unshakable peace. It is to release the anxious need to label every event, to control every outcome. It is to understand that we cannot know the full story. We are all like the old farmer, living in a world of constant change. We can choose to be tossed about by the waves of fortune and misfortune, our emotions rising and falling with each new event. Or we can learn to cultivate a quiet heart, a mind that simply says, maybe. This is the freedom of non-attachment. It is not a cold indifference, but a warm, trusting embrace of life in its totality. It is the wisdom to accept both the sunshine and the storm, knowing that they are both part of a larger, unknowable pattern. It is the peace that comes from letting go of our stories about what is happening and simply allowing what is happening to be. And in that quiet, accepting space, the mind can finally come to rest, free from the exhausting cycle of hope and fear, ready for a sleep as deep and untroubled as the old farmer's calm and steady heart. The villagers never fully understood Wei, but they came to respect his stillness. In times of drought or flood, when others were consumed by panic and despair, Wei would continue his work with the same quiet rhythm. When the harvest was unexpectedly bountiful and others celebrated with loud feasts and drank until the early hours, Wei would enjoy a simple meal with his son, his gratitude as quiet and deep as his sorrow had been. His presence became a kind of anchor for the village. People began to seek him out, not for advice on farming, but for a different kind of nourishment. They would sit with him in the evenings, and though he rarely offered words of wisdom, his calm was contagious. It seeped into their own anxious hearts, reminding them of a different way to be. Wei's son, as his leg slowly healed, underwent the most profound transformation of all. Lying in his bed for those long months, he had nothing to do but watch his father. He watched him mend tools, cook their simple meals, and tend to the small garden behind their hut. He saw the patience in his father's hands, the acceptance in his eyes. At first, the boy's immobility had been a source of intense frustration. He was a creature of action, and being confined was a kind of torture. He raged against his fate, against the wild stallion, against his own foolish pride. His mind was a storm of if-onlys. If only he had been more careful, if only the horses had never come. But his father's steady, non-judgmental presence was a silent lesson. Wei never told his son to be patient. He never offered platitudes about fate. He simply cared for him, his touch gentle, his voice calm. He would bring him his food, change the dressings on his leg, and sometimes he would just sit by his bed in companionable silence. In this atmosphere of unconditional acceptance, the boy's inner storm slowly began to subside. He started to see the world through his father's eyes. He noticed things he had never seen before from his small window. He watched the slow, deliberate journey of a snail across a wet leaf. He saw the intricate dance of light and shadow as the sun moved across the sky. He began to understand that his father's maybe was not a sign of confusion or indifference. It was an expression of the deepest wisdom. It was the recognition that reality is too vast, too complex, and too interconnected to be captured by our small, impatient judgments of good and bad. His broken leg, which he had seen as the greatest tragedy of his young life, had saved him from the war. It had saved his life. But his father had not called it good luck. Why? The boy pondered this for many weeks, and then he began to understand. To call it good luck would be to create a new story, a new attachment. It would be to cling to one outcome and fear another. It would be to say, "This is good, and I want more of this," and by implication, "That was bad, and I want to avoid that." This clinging, this preference, is the very root of anxiety. It is the engine that drives the endless cycle of hope and fear. His father lived in a different space. He lived in the present moment, accepting what it brought without labeling it. The horse ran away. He worked the fields by hand. The horses returned. He cared for them. His son broke his leg. He tended to the wound. The army came. His son was spared. Each event was met with the same calm, present attention. He was not a passive victim of fate. He was an active participant in the flow of life, moving with the current instead of struggling against it. He was free because he had let go of the need for the river to flow in any particular direction. When the boy was finally able to walk again, with the slight limp the healer had predicted, he was no longer the same impetuous youth who had leaped onto the back of the wild stallion. The fire was still in him, but it was tempered now with a quiet depth. He returned to the horses, but with a new kind of patience. He learned to listen to them, to understand their nature, and to work with them rather than trying to conquer them. He became the finest horse trainer in the entire province, known not for his force, but for his gentle, intuitive understanding. Years passed. The old farmer grew older, his steps slower, but his eyes as clear as ever. The son married and had children of his own. The war in the distant province ended, and a few of the village boys, now gaunt and haunted men, returned with stories of unimaginable horror. They looked at the farmer's son, at his peaceful life, his happy family, and the limp that had saved him, and they understood the wisdom of his father. One day, the old farmer, Wei, passed away peacefully in his sleep. The entire village mourned, for they had lost their anchor. At the simple funeral, people spoke of his strange wisdom. "He taught us that you can never know what is a blessing and what is a curse," said the baker, now an old man himself. Wei's son, standing before the small gathering, listened to their words. He looked at the faces of his friends and family, at the mountains that cradled their valley, the same mountains his father had looked at every day of his life. When it was his turn to speak, he did not tell stories of his father's life. He did not try to summarize his wisdom. He simply stood in silence for a long moment, letting the shared grief and love of the community fill the space. Then he looked at them all, his gaze calm and full of a deep, inherited peace. And all he said was, "Maybe." And in that single word, they all understood. He was not dismissing their grief or their love. He was honoring the great mystery. He was acknowledging that even death, the event we label as the ultimate tragedy, is just one more turn in the river. We cannot see where the water goes. We cannot know the whole story. The only freedom, the only peace, lies in letting go of our need to know, in releasing our desperate grip on our judgments, and in learning to float in the great, unknowable, and ever-changing current of what is. It is a peace that allows for both sorrow and joy, a stillness that can hold everything, a quiet heart that prepares us for the deepest and most final rest. Part 5. Escaping the Burning House. There was once a man named Kaito, a merchant of great wealth and even greater wisdom. His life had been a long journey, not only across the Silk Roads and the wide blue seas, but through the inner landscapes of the human heart. He'd seen empires rise and fall, had known both staggering loss and profound abundance. And through it all, he'd learned to see the world with clear, compassionate eyes. Now, in his later years, he'd retired to a vast, sprawling estate that had been in his family for generations. The mansion was ancient and magnificent, a labyrinth of corridors, courtyards, and hidden rooms. Its wooden pillars were carved with dragons and phoenixes, and its paper screens were painted with delicate landscapes of mountains and rivers. But time is a patient and relentless force. The mansion, for all its grandeur, was in a state of slow decay. The foundations were crumbling, the roof tiles were loose, and the great wooden beams, once strong as iron, were now dry and brittle, riddled with the secret work of insects. In the cool, dark corners of the storerooms, venomous snakes sometimes slept, and in the dusty attics, the air was thick with the ghosts of old, forgotten things. Kaito lived in this vast, decaying house with his many children. There were dozens of them, boys and girls of all ages, full of the vibrant, heedless energy of youth. They were his greatest joy and his deepest concern, for the children saw none of the decay. They were utterly oblivious to the dangers that surrounded them. Their world was the world of play, a world of vivid and all-consuming imagination. They would spend their days lost in their games. Some would build tall towers from wooden blocks, their brows furrowed with concentration, their hearts set on making their tower the highest, only to have it tumble and then begin again, trapped in an endless cycle of ambition and collapse. Others would gather shiny pebbles and colored beads, hoarding them in secret corners, counting them, comparing them, their happiness rising and falling with the size of their collection. Still others would create elaborate puppet shows, their minds completely captivated by the dramas of love and betrayal they made the little wooden figures enact, forgetting that they themselves were the ones pulling the strings. The house was their playground, their entire universe. They did not notice the cracks in the walls or the dust in the air. The faint, musty smell of decay was simply the air they had always breathed. They were so absorbed in their games, so lost in their small worlds of wanting and getting, winning and losing, that they had no eyes for the reality of their situation. Kaito, the father, saw it all clearly. He loved his children more than anything, but his love was tinged with a deep and constant worry. He knew the house was no longer safe. He knew it was only a matter of time before disaster struck. And then, one afternoon, it happened. A fire started. It began in a single place, in a pile of dry straw near the stables, but the old, dry wood of the mansion was perfect fuel. The flames, small at first, grew with a terrifying speed, licking at the walls, devouring everything in their path. A thick, acrid smoke began to pour through the corridors. The house had only one main gate for escape, and the fire was spreading, threatening to block it. Kaito was outside in the main garden when he saw the first plumes of smoke. A terrible, cold dread seized him. His children. They were all inside, scattered throughout the vast house, each one lost in their private world of play. He ran to the gate, his heart pounding in his chest. "Children!" he shouted, his voice raw with panic. "Come out! The house is on fire! You must leave, now! Come out!" A few of the older children, playing near the entrance hall, heard his voice. They looked up from their games, their faces blank with incomprehension. Fire? What was fire? It was just a word, a distant concept that had nothing to do with the urgent business of their play. They glanced at the doorway, saw their father's frantic gestures, and then, with a dismissive shrug, turned back to their toys. The game was far more real, far more compelling than their father's strange and alarming words. The smoke grew thicker. Kaito could feel the heat on his face. He knew he could not run inside and carry them out one by one. There were too many of them, and they were scattered in too many rooms. If he went in to find one, he might become trapped himself, and then they would all be lost. He was strong, but he was not strong enough to fight both the fire and the powerful grip of his children's attachments to their games. He shouted again, his voice cracking with desperation. "The house is burning! There are snakes and scorpions! The roof will collapse! You are in terrible danger! Please, listen to me!" His words were meaningless to them. They were like a man trying to describe the color blue to someone born blind. The danger was not part of their reality. The only reality was the game in front of them, the desire to win, the fear of losing, the pleasure of their imaginary worlds. These were the forces that held them captive. Kaito stood at the gate, watching the flames grow higher, feeling a helplessness so profound it was like a physical blow. He saw the truth with a terrible clarity. He could not save them by telling them the truth. The truth was a language they did not understand. Their minds were locked. He could not pull them out against their will. He had to find a way to make them want to come out. And in that moment of desperate clarity, a new kind of wisdom arose in him. It was the wisdom of skillful means. He stopped shouting about the danger. He calmed his frantic heart, and he thought about his children. What did they love? What did they desire more than anything? What call could be more powerful than the call of their games? Toys. Beautiful, rare, wonderful toys. Carts to ride in, pulled by magnificent animals. His face changed. The look of terror was replaced by one of calm, compassionate cunning. He took a deep breath and called out to them again. But this time, his voice was not filled with panic. It was filled with excitement and promise. "Children, children, listen to me," he called, his voice ringing with joy. "Come outside, quickly. I have a wonderful surprise for you, waiting here just outside the gate. I have brought you the most amazing toys you have ever seen." He let his words sink in, then continued, painting a vivid picture in their minds. "I have beautiful carts for you. For the little ones, there are small carts pulled by gentle goats with soft cushions to sit on. And for the older children, I have swift carts pulled by graceful deer that can run as fast as the wind. And for the eldest, I have magnificent, sturdy carts pulled by great, strong oxen, decorated with bells and jewels. They are all here, right now, just outside the gate. But you must come now if you want to choose the one you like best. Come out and see." This time, the children heard. This time, the words were not about a danger they could not comprehend, but about a desire they understood perfectly. Carts. Goat carts, deer carts, ox carts, more wonderful than any of their current toys. A sudden, powerful new desire was sparked in their hearts. Their current games, which had seemed so important just a moment before, now seemed dull and uninteresting by comparison. A murmur went through the house. The boy with the blocks abandoned his half-built tower. The girl with the pebbles dropped her collection, the stones scattering across the floor. The children with the puppets let them fall in a tangled heap. From every room, from every corner of the vast, burning mansion, They came running. They pushed and jostled each other, their faces alight with eagerness, their minds filled with visions of the beautiful carts. They poured out of the single gate, a rushing river of children, their eyes fixed not on the flames that were now consuming their home, but on the promise of a greater prize. They ran out into the fresh, clean air, out into the safety of the garden, and gathered around their father, looking around expectantly. "Father, where are the carts? Where are the goat carts and the deer carts?" Kaito looked at them, his heart overflowing with a love and relief so immense it was almost painful. They were all safe. They were all out. Behind them, with a deafening roar, the main roof of the old mansion collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame. The house that had been their entire world was gone. The children stared, their mouths agape, finally seeing the terrible fire they had been saved from. A hush fell over them as they began to understand the true nature of their escape. Kaito smiled, a gentle, loving smile. He had not lied to them. He had promised them something wonderful to lure them from a danger they could not see. And now he would give them a gift far greater than anything he had described. He led them to a clearing, and there, waiting for them, was a single, magnificent vehicle. It was not a small goat cart, nor a swift deer cart, nor even a sturdy ox cart. It was a great white ox cart, larger and more beautiful than anything they could have imagined. It was vast and luminous, its wheels silent and strong, its frame adorned with the 7 precious jewels of wisdom, compassion, diligence, joy, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. It was pulled by a great white ox, its muscles powerful, its steps even and steady, its gaze serene. The cart was large enough for all of them, a single vehicle to carry them all on the journey ahead. "This," Kaito said, his voice soft and full of love, "is for all of you. It is the one true cart. It is far greater than the goat, deer, and ox carts I promised. In this, we will all travel together to a land of perfect peace and safety." This ancient story is a parable for our own lives. The burning house is our world of suffering, the cycle of samsara. It is our own mind, filled with the decaying structures of our habits, our fears, and our attachments. The flames are the fires of greed, anger, and ignorance that consume us from within. And we, like the children, are so absorbed in our games, the games of accumulating wealth, seeking status, chasing pleasure, running from pain, that we do not see the danger we are in. We do not notice the ever-present reality of impermanence, dissatisfaction, and the certainty of change. The Father is the compassionate wisdom of the Buddha, the wisdom that exists within each of us. This wisdom sees the danger clearly and wants only to lead us to safety. But it cannot do so by force. It cannot save us by simply shouting the truth of our suffering, because we are too attached to our games to listen. So, it uses skillful means. It offers us beautiful toys. The goat cart might be the simple joy of living an ethical life. The deer cart might be the profound calm that comes from meditation. The ox cart might be the initial insights of wisdom. These are the wholesome pleasures that lure us away from our destructive attachments. We begin to practice not because we fully understand the nature of suffering, but because we are drawn to the promise of a greater happiness, a deeper peace. And so we run out of the burning house. We let go of our obsessive games, not through a grim act of will, but because we have found something more beautiful, more compelling. And once we are outside, In the clear, open space of liberation, we are given the final, greatest gift: the great white ox cart. This is the one vehicle, the ultimate teaching, the path that reveals we are all capable of attaining the same profound peace and wisdom as the Buddha. It is the realization that the true goal was never just a temporary state of calm or a small insight, but the complete and utter freedom from the burning house forever. To prepare for sleep is to answer the call of the compassionate Father. It is to recognize, even just for a moment, that the games of worry, planning, and regret are taking place in a burning house. It is to be lured by the promise of something better, the simple, profound peace of a quiet mind. We can let go of our toys, our anxieties, and our attachments, and run out of the single gate of the present moment into the cool, safe, open space of rest. Here, there is no fire, no smoke, only the vast, starry sky of a mind at peace, ready to be carried by the great, silent cart into the land of deep and restorative sleep. Let us look more closely at the games the children were playing, for they are our games. Consider the boy with the wooden blocks. His entire world was consumed by the desire to build a tower higher than his brothers. When a block was placed perfectly, a jolt of pleasure and pride would run through him. When the tower wobbled, a wave of anxiety would seize his heart. And when it finally crashed, a hot flush of anger and despair would overwhelm him. His happiness was completely dependent on the unstable arrangement of a few pieces of wood. Is this not our own game of ambition and career? We build our towers of status, wealth, and achievement. We carefully place each block: a promotion, a successful project, a new acquisition. We feel a fleeting sense of satisfaction when our tower is higher than our neighbor's. We live in constant, low-grade anxiety that the market will shift, that a competitor will overtake us, that our skills will become obsolete, that the tower will wobble. And when we face a setback, a lost job, a failed venture, the crash feels catastrophic, a personal failing that shakes our very sense of self. We are so absorbed in the building, the worrying, and the rebuilding that we fail to notice the smoke seeping under the door. Or consider the girl with her collection of shiny pebbles. She was not building anything. Her joy came from possessing. She would spend hours arranging her stones, polishing them, admiring their colors, and comparing her collection to those of her friends. Her sense of self-worth was tied to the quantity and quality of her pebbles. The discovery of a new, rare stone would fill her with delight. The thought of losing one, or seeing a friend with a more beautiful collection, would cause a pang of envy and fear. This is the game of materialism, of accumulation. Our pebbles may be a bigger house, a faster car, a more fashionable wardrobe, or even a collection of experiences we can display to others. We arrange and polish our possessions, hoping they will bring us lasting happiness. We are caught in the endless cycle of wanting, getting, and wanting more. The pleasure of a new acquisition is always temporary, and it is quickly replaced by the anxiety of protecting what we have and the desire for the next shiny thing. We are so busy counting our pebbles that we do not feel the heat of the approaching flames. And what of the children with the puppets? They were lost in the world of drama and relationships. They created intricate stories of love, jealousy, friendship, and betrayal. They would laugh with their puppets, cry for them, and rage at their injustices. They forgot that the puppets were just wood and cloth, and that the stories were of their own making. The dramas felt intensely real, all-consuming. This is our own game of emotional attachment. We cast ourselves and the people in our lives as characters in a grand drama. We cling to our stories of who is the hero, who is the villain, who has wronged us, and who we cannot live without. We replay past conversations, nurse old grievances, and live in anxious anticipation of future encounters. Our minds are a constant theater of he said, she said, of resentments and expectations. We are so captivated by the puppet show of our own emotions that we do not hear the crackle of the burning beams overhead. The father's compassionate genius was in understanding that he could not win an argument with the games themselves. To tell the boy that his tower of blocks is meaningless is to invite resistance. To tell the girl that her pebbles are just worthless stones is to cause her pain. To tell the children that their puppet show is not real is to be met with blank incomprehension. The attachments are too strong. The illusion is too powerful. Instead of attacking the games, he offered a better game. He used the very energy of desire that was trapping them to set them free. He did not say, "Stop wanting." He said, "Want this instead. It is far more beautiful." This is the essence of skillful means. It is not a trick or a deception, but a compassionate strategy that meets us where we are. The path to freedom does not always begin with a profound understanding of emptiness. It often begins with the simple, wholesome desire for a calmer mind, a more loving heart, a moment of relief from our own inner turmoil. The promise of the goat cart, a simple, peaceful state, is what first coaxes us to leave our burning towers and our shiny pebbles behind. And once we are outside, in the clear air, our perspective shifts. We look back at the inferno and see, for the first time, the true nature of the place we called home. We see the impermanence, the danger, the inherent unsatisfactoriness of it all. In that moment of seeing, our attachment to the old games withers and dies. Not because we forced it, but because we have outgrown it. We have seen something real, and the illusion can no longer hold us. It is only then that we are ready to see the great white ox cart, the true vehicle of liberation, which was waiting for us all along. It is the realization that the path itself, with all its skillful lures and stages, leads to one ultimate destination, a stable, unshakable peace that is our true nature. Part 6. The raft is not the shore. Imagine a woman named Amaya. She lived on the bank of a vast and powerful river. The shore where she lived was a place of constant turmoil. The air was thick with the dust of endless activity, the noise of arguments and anxious chatter, the cries of merchants selling wares that promised happiness but delivered only fleeting pleasure. The ground was hard and unforgiving, and the people there, including Amaya, lived with a persistent, low hum of fear. They feared the river's floods. They feared the scarcity of the dry season. And most of all, they feared each other, their hearts guarded and their hands quick to grasp and hold. This was the shore of suffering, the world as we often experience it, a place of clinging and strife. But from this shore, on a clear day, one could just make out the other side. It was a distant, hazy line of green, a promise of something different. The elders spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. They called it the shore of peace, of liberation. They said that over there, the ground was soft, the air was still, and the heart was free from fear. There were no markets, for there was nothing to want. There was no strife, for there was nothing to defend. Amaya's heart ached with a deep longing for that other shore. The noise and dust of her world had become unbearable. The constant cycle of desire and disappointment had left her weary to the bone.
Looked at the river, a wide, churning expanse of brown water, and it seemed an impossible obstacle. The currents were treacherous, full of hidden snags and powerful whirlpools. No one knew how to swim across it. To enter the river was to be swept away and lost. One day, a teacher came to the village. He was a quiet man, with eyes that held the calm of the distant shore. He did not promise to carry anyone across the river. Instead, he taught them how to build a raft. "The teachings are the raft," he explained, his voice as gentle as the evening breeze. "They are not the destination, but they are the means to get there. You must build it yourself, with your own hands and your own effort." Amaya became his most diligent student. She listened to every word, her heart a thirsty field drinking in a long-awaited rain. She began to gather the materials for her raft. The first logs were the precepts, the commitment to not harm, not steal, not lie, not engage in heedless indulgence. These were the strong, foundational pieces of her vessel. At first, they felt heavy and awkward. To live by these rules in a world of deceit and harm was difficult. But as she bound them together, she found they gave her a new kind of stability. They were a solid place to stand in the midst of chaos. Next, she gathered the bamboo poles of mindfulness and concentration. She learned to sit in silence, to watch her breath, to observe the frantic clamor of her own mind without being swept away by it. Each moment of stillness, each breath she followed from beginning to end, was another pole, light but incredibly strong, that she added to her raft. This was painstaking work. Her mind would wander 1,000 times, pulled by the currents of old habits, worries, and daydreams. But each time, she would gently, patiently bring it back. She was not just gathering bamboo, she was learning the art of weaving, of bringing focus and coherence to her scattered thoughts. Finally, she collected the strong, flexible vines of wisdom. These were the teachings on impermanence, on non-attachment, on the nature of suffering and its cessation. She learned to see that everything on her shore, her possessions, her relationships, her own body, her very thoughts, was in a constant state of flux, like the flowing water of the river itself. To cling to anything was to cling to a shadow, to grasp at water. This understanding was the vine that would bind the entire raft together, making it resilient, able to bend with the currents without breaking. For months, Amaya worked. Her raft grew, piece by piece, under the patient guidance of her teacher. It was not a beautiful thing. It was a rough, functional vessel, marked with the sweat and struggle of its construction. But it was strong. It was hers. It was her hope, her discipline, her wisdom made manifest. Her fellow villagers watched her, some with scorn, others with a flicker of curiosity. They were too busy with their own worldly games to undertake such a difficult task. They preferred to stay on the familiar shore,
complaining about the dust, rather than build the means of their own escape. The day came when the raft was finished. Amaya stood at the water's edge, her heart a mixture of fear and determination. The river looked as menacing as ever, but now she was not facing it alone and empty-handed. She had her raft. She thanked her teacher, who simply nodded and smiled, and then, with a great push, she launched her vessel into the water and climbed aboard. The journey was perilous. As soon as she left the shallows, a powerful current of greed caught her, trying to pull her downstream toward an island of glittering, illusory treasures. But she held on to the logs of her precepts, her commitment to simplicity, and she paddled hard with her concentration, steering herself back toward the far shore. A great whirlpool of anger and resentment threatened to trap her, a dark, spinning vortex of old hurts and grievances. It tried to pull her down into its murky depths, but she used her mindfulness to see the anger for what it was, just energy, just a storm in the water. And she used the wisdom of non-attachment to loosen its grip, allowing the raft to glide past the danger. At times, a thick fog of doubt would descend, and she would lose sight of the other shore completely. In those moments of blindness and despair, she was tempted to give up, to let the river take her where it would. But she would feel the solidness of the raft beneath her, the result of her own hard work, and she would remember her teacher's words. She would simply sit, watch her breath, and wait for the fog to lift, trusting in the integrity of the vessel she had built. The journey took a long, long time, but with every challenge she overcame, her trust in the raft grew. The raft was her savior, her companion, her entire world. It was the embodiment of the path. She came to love it, to cherish every log, every vine, every piece of bamboo. It was more precious to her than anything she had left behind on the shore of suffering. And then, one day, she felt a gentle bump. The raft had stopped moving. She looked up, and through the thinning mist, she saw it, the other shore. It was just as the elders had described, yet more simple, more real than she had ever imagined. The ground was covered in soft, green moss. Ancient trees stood in silent contemplation. The air was so still, so pure, that she could hear the sound of her own heartbeat. There was no noise, no dust, no fear. There was only a profound and all-encompassing peace. With tears of gratitude streaming down her face, Amaya stepped off the raft and onto the solid ground of liberation. She had arrived. The journey was over. She was safe. She stood for a long time, breathing in the clean air, feeling the deep, quiet joy of arrival. She turned and looked back at her raft, which rested half in and half out of the water. Her dear, faithful raft. It had carried her through every danger. It had saved her life. A wave of deep affection and gratitude washed over her. I cannot leave it here, she thought. It is too precious. It is the proof of my journey, the symbol of my attainment. It is a part of me. And so, with great effort, she began to pull the heavy, waterlogged raft out of the river and onto the shore. It was a clumsy, difficult task. The logs were heavy, the vines were slippery, but her attachment was strong. Finally, she managed to heave it onto her back. She bent under its immense weight, her legs trembling, and began to walk inland, determined to carry her beloved raft with her. But the shore of peace was not made for such burdens. As she tried to walk through a grove of slender, silent trees, the raft's wide frame crashed against the trunks, blocking her path. She tried to climb a gentle, mossy hill to see the view, but the weight of the raft was too great. She kept slipping and falling. She wanted to sit and rest by a clear, still pond, but she could not find a comfortable position with the awkward, heavy structure strapped to her back. The very thing that had been her means of freedom on the water had become her prison on the land. The tool that had saved her was now the burden that was preventing her from truly experiencing the peace she had sought for so long. She was on the shore of liberation, but she was not free. She was still attached, still clinging, still carrying a great weight. Exhausted and confused, she finally collapsed under the weight of her raft. She lay there, her breath ragged, her heart full of a strange sorrow. And in the deep silence of that place, the teacher's words came back to her, as clear as if he were standing right beside her. The teachings are the raft. They are not the destination. The truth of it struck her with the force of a lightning bolt. She had made the raft into an idol. She had become attached to the path itself. She had mistaken the tool for the goal. The purpose of the raft was to cross the river. It had done its job perfectly. Its purpose was now fulfilled. To carry it on the shore was a kind of madness, a profound misunderstanding. Slowly, painfully, she struggled out from under the raft. She stood up, feeling impossibly light. She looked at the raft, no longer with the grasping love of possession, but with a new, purer love of deep gratitude. She walked over to it and placed her hand on its rough, wet wood. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she walked back to the water's edge. She did not need to carry the raft. She simply left it there, resting on the bank, a silent offering for any other traveler who might one day need it. She turned her back on the river and began to walk inland once more. But this time, she was unburdened. She was light. She walked easily through the grove of trees, her movements silent and graceful. She climbed the small hill with ease and looked out over the vast landscape. She sat by the still pond and saw her own face reflected in its clear water, a face no longer etched with worry and striving, but filled with a quiet, luminous peace. She had finally understood. The precepts, the meditation, the wisdom, they were all essential for the journey, but the goal was not to become a perfect precept keeper, a master of meditation, or a scholar of wisdom. The goal was simply to be free. And true freedom meant letting go of everything, including the very tools that had brought her to freedom's shore. As night falls and we prepare for sleep, we too stand on the shore of peace. The day, with its struggles and its efforts, is the river we have just crossed. The tools we used, our plans, our worries, our identities, our very thoughts, were the raft that helped us navigate the currents. But now we have arrived. This moment of quiet, this threshold of rest, is the other shore. We do not need to carry the raft of the day's events into the peaceful land of sleep. We can leave it at the water's edge. We can release our grip on what we have done and what we must do tomorrow. We can let go of the raft with gratitude for its service and walk, light and unburdened, into the deep, restorative silence of the night. Amaya's days on the new shore were a study in simplicity. She did not build a house, for the sky was her roof and the soft earth was her floor. She did not gather possessions, for the wild berries were her food and the clear spring water was her drink. Her life became a seamless flow, a dance with the present moment. The raft, resting by the river, became a distant memory, a story from another lifetime. But one day, a new feeling began to stir within her. It was not the old restlessness of the shore of suffering, but a quiet, compassionate impulse. She found herself walking back toward the river, drawn by a force she did not fully understand. As she stood on the bank, looking across the churning water, she saw them, the people she had left behind. She could see them scurrying about in the dust, their faces tight with anxiety, their movements hurried and fearful. She saw them arguing over trinkets, building their flimsy shelters of pride and ambition, and casting fearful glances at the river they believed was an impassable barrier. Her heart ached with a profound, impersonal love. It was not the clinging, possessive love she had known before, but a vast, open compassion that wished only for their freedom. She saw herself in them. She remembered the dust, the fear, the deep, weary longing for peace. She looked at the raft, her raft, still resting on the shore. It was a good raft. It was strong. It could make the journey again. But who would guide it? Who would teach them to build their own? In that moment, she understood the final part of the lesson. The shore of peace was not a final destination in the sense of a permanent retreat. It was a home base, a place of deep renewal from which one could act in the world with true freedom. To be truly liberated was not just to save oneself, but to turn back and offer a hand to others still caught in the current. This is the Bodhisattva vow, the great promise to not enter final nirvana until all beings are free. It is the ultimate act of letting go even of one's own perfect peace for the sake of others. Amaya did not get back on the raft. She did not need it anymore. Her understanding was now so complete that she could walk on the water. Her compassion was her vessel, her wisdom her guide. She walked back across the turbulent river, her feet barely touching the waves, her presence a beacon of impossible calm. When she arrived back on the shore of suffering, the people stared at her in disbelief. Her clothes were the same simple robes, but her face was luminous. Her eyes held a peace they had only ever dreamed of. She did not preach or scold. She did not tell them their lives were full of suffering. She simply began to live among them, and her way of being was her teaching. She showed them, not with words but with her actions, how to find the materials for a raft. When she saw someone caught in the grip of anger, she did not tell them, "Do not be angry." She would sit with them, her own calm presence a soothing balm, and then gently show them the strong, straight bamboo of mindfulness they could use to build a foundation of inner stillness. When she saw people grasping at possessions, their hearts full of the fear of loss, she did not lecture them on the folly of materialism. She would show them the joy of generosity, the lightness that comes from giving. And in doing so, she taught them how to gather the resilient vines of non-attachment. She taught them that the raft was not a magical gift. It had to be built. The work was hard and often discouraging. Many started and gave up, lured back by the familiar distractions of the shore. But for those who persisted, she was a constant, patient guide. She helped them tie the knots of concentration. She showed them how to test the strength of their precepts, and she reminded them, always, of the reality of the other shore. She became a living example of the teaching. She was the one who had crossed the river, and yet she was here, with them. She had built and used the raft, and yet she was not attached to it. Her freedom was not a distant, otherworldly state, but a practical, present-moment reality. She showed them that the shore of peace was not a geographical location, but a state of mind, a way of being that could be cultivated right here, in the midst of the dust and the noise. Amaya had learned the ultimate lesson of the raft. The purpose of the teachings is to free us from suffering. Once we are free, the teachings themselves must be released, lest they become a new, more subtle form of bondage. A spiritual pride, an attachment to concepts, a dogmatic certainty. But this letting go is not a final act of abandonment. It is a transformation. The raft, once let go of, is no longer an external object we possess. Its qualities, stability, resilience, wisdom, become integrated into our very being. We no longer need the raft because we have become the raft. We are the vessel that can carry ourselves and others across the turbulent waters of life. As we lie down to sleep, we can reflect on our own rafts. What are the beliefs, the practices, the identities we have used to navigate our day? Perhaps it is the identity of a good parent, a successful professional, a spiritual person. These rafts have served us. They have given us structure and purpose. But as we enter the shore of sleep, a place of deep letting go, we can release them. We do not need to carry our professional identity into our dreams. We do not need to cling to our spiritual self-concept as we rest. We can, with gratitude, leave the raft on the shore. And in that unburdened emptiness, we find a peace that is not dependent on any tool or any identity. It is the simple, profound peace of our own true nature, a shore of quiet that was always here, waiting for our arrival. Part 7. The Weight of a Single Stone. In a monastery renowned for its rigorous discipline, there lived a master named Ryokan. He was not like the other masters. While they were known for their sharp, incisive koans and their demanding presence in the meditation hall, Ryokan was known for his gentleness and his unconventional teaching methods. He found his lessons not in ancient texts, but in the rustle of leaves, the flow of water, and the simple, everyday struggles of his young disciples. One spring morning, when the cherry blossoms were scattering like pink snow in the courtyard, Ryokan gathered his students. They were a young and earnest group, their faces bright with the desire for enlightenment. They believed the path was a great, heroic struggle, a dramatic battle against the forces of delusion. They were eager to be given a difficult task, a challenge that would prove their spiritual strength. Ryokan looked at their eager faces, a soft, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Today," he said, his voice as calm as the morning air, "we will take a walking meditation. We will journey to the waterfall at the top of the mountain and return by sunset. There is only one rule for this journey." He paused, letting the anticipation build. The young monks leaned in, their ears ready to receive some profound and complex instruction. Ryokan bent down and picked up a small, smooth stone from the path. It was no bigger than a pigeon's egg, a simple, grey river stone. He held it up for them to see. "Each of you will choose one stone, like this one. You must carry it with you for the entire journey. You must not put it down, not for a single moment. You must hold it in your hand." The monks were perplexed. This was the great task? To carry a small stone? It seemed trivial, almost childish. They had expected a lesson on emptiness or a difficult koan to wrestle with. But they were obedient students. Each monk dutifully bent down and selected a small stone. One chose a flat, white stone that felt cool against his palm. Another chose a dark, speckled one with a pleasing round shape. A young monk named Kenji, known for his ambition, searched for a moment longer and chose one that was perfectly smooth and slightly larger than the others, feeling a small, secret pride in his choice. They held the stones in their hands. They were light, almost weightless. The monks exchanged confused glances. This was no challenge at all. It was nothing. "Let us begin," Ryokan said, and he started to walk, his own small stone resting lightly in his open palm. The first part of the journey was pleasant. The path wound through a forest of tall cedars, and the air was cool and fragrant. The monks walked in a single file, their minds initially focused on the novelty of the task. Kenji, the ambitious one, was almost amused by the lightness of his stone. He could feel its smooth, solid presence in his hand. It was a comfort, a small anchor to the present moment. He focused on its texture, its temperature, its subtle weight. This, he thought, must be the point of the lesson, a simple exercise in mindfulness. He felt a sense of satisfaction. He was doing it well. As the morning wore on and the path began to climb, a subtle change began to occur. The stone, which had felt so light, so insignificant, began to assert its presence in a new way. It was no longer just an object of meditation. It was a weight. It was a small but constant physical demand. Kenji found he could no longer hold it loosely in an open palm as the master did. He had to close his fingers around it to maintain his grip as he navigated the steeper parts of the path. The constant pressure of the stone against his skin began to create a dull ache in his fingers. He tried shifting it from one hand to the other, but the relief was only temporary. The other hand, unaccustomed to the task, tired even more quickly. By midday, when they stopped for a brief rest by a stream, the stone was no longer a triviality. It was an annoyance. It was a burden. The simple act of holding it had become a conscious, tiring effort. Kenji watched as the other monks ate their simple meal of rice balls. They struggled to eat with one hand, the other still dutifully clutching their stone. He saw them flexing their fingers, rubbing their aching palms. A shared, unspoken frustration hung in the air. The stone was a constant, irritating presence. It prevented them from fully relaxing, from enjoying the cool water of the stream or the taste of their food. Kenji looked at Master Ryokan. The old master sat peacefully on a rock, his own stone still resting in his open hand, as if it were a part of him, a natural extension of his own body. There was no sign of strain or irritation on his face. He seemed to have forgotten he was even holding it. Kenji felt a flicker of resentment. What was the point of this senseless exercise? It was just a distraction, a pointless physical hardship that was preventing him from engaging in real spiritual practice. His mind began to fill with complaints. My hand hurts. This is a waste of time. I wish I had chosen a smaller stone. Why are we doing this? The stone was no longer just a physical weight. It had become a mental one. His thoughts began to circle around it, obsessed with the discomfort it was causing. The beautiful forest, the sound of the stream, the warmth of the sun, all of it faded into the background. His entire world had shrunk to the size of the small, aching space of his own hand. The afternoon's journey was an ordeal. The path grew steeper and more rugged. The sun beat down, and sweat trickled down the monks' faces. And the stone grew heavier. It was a physical impossibility, of course. The stone's weight was constant. But Kenji would have sworn it was gaining mass with every step, as if it were absorbing his own fatigue and frustration, becoming denser and more malevolent. His arm ached. The pain was no longer just in his hand, but had spread to his wrist, his forearm, even his shoulder. The stone had become a source of torment. He began to fantasize about throwing it, about hurling it deep into the forest where it could never be found. The desire to simply open his hand and let it fall was almost overwhelming. It was a constant battle of will, a fight against the simplest of impulses, the impulse to let go. He looked at the faces of his fellow monks. Their jaws were clenched, their brows furrowed. The easy camaraderie of the morning was gone, replaced by a grim, solitary endurance. Each monk was locked in his own private battle with a small, gray stone. Finally, late in the afternoon, they reached their destination. The waterfall was a magnificent sight, a curtain of white water cascading down a sheer rock face into a crystal-clear pool. The air was filled with its roar and a cool, refreshing mist. On any other day, the monks would have been filled with awe and joy at the sight. But today, they barely noticed. Their only thought was of the stones in their hands. Ryokan walked to the edge of the pool and turned to face his exhausted students. "You may put down your stones now," he said, his voice calm and clear over the sound of the water. The relief was instantaneous and overwhelming. With sighs of profound gratitude, the monks opened their hands. The stones fell to the ground with a series of small, final clicks. Kenji watched his own stone drop, and as it left his palm, a wave of release so powerful it made him dizzy washed over him. His hand felt strangely light, almost ethereal. He flexed his fingers, feeling the blood rush back into them. The release from the physical pain was immense, but it was more than that. It was a release from a mental prison. He had not realized how completely his mind had been held captive by that small object until it was gone. The monks rushed to the pool, plunging their aching hands into the icy water, groaning with pleasure. For a few minutes, they were silent, simply savoring the freedom from their burden. Ryokan let them enjoy the moment. Then he gathered them around him. "Tell me," he said, "what did you learn on our journey today?" One monk spoke up immediately. "I learned that even a small burden carried for a long time can become unbearable." Another added, "I learned that the weight of the stone was not just in the stone itself, but in my resistance to it. The more I hated it, the heavier it seemed." Kenji, feeling a new sense of clarity, spoke next, his voice quiet. "I learned that the stone made me blind. I was so focused on the pain in my hand that I did not see the beauty of the forest. The burden I was carrying filled my entire world." Ryokan nodded, his eyes filled with a deep, compassionate warmth. "Yes," he said. "You have all understood a part of the lesson. Now, let me ask you this. What is the stone?" The monks were silent, pondering the question. "The stone," Ryokan continued, is anything you carry in your mind. It is the small worry you picked up this morning about a task you must complete. It is the small resentment you have been holding against your brother for a careless word he spoke last week. It is the small regret about a mistake you made yesterday. It is the small anxiety about what might happen tomorrow. He looked around at their faces, seeing the dawning of a deeper understanding. Each of these thoughts, by itself, seems as light and insignificant as the small stone you held in your hand this morning. It is nothing. You pick it up, and you tell yourself, I can carry this. And so you hold on to it. You carry it with you through your day. But you do not put it down. You carry that small resentment with you into the meditation hall. You carry that small worry with you to your evening meal. You carry that small regret with you as you try to sleep. And you do not carry just one. You pick up another and another. A stone of jealousy, a stone of pride, a stone of fear. And soon your mind, which was once open and spacious, is full. Your hands are clenched. You are so focused on the weight of all these small stones that you cannot feel the warmth of the sun or taste the sweetness of your tea. The path of your life, which is full of beauty and wonder, becomes a long, arduous journey, a grim endurance. The weight of it all creates a constant ache, a tension in your heart that you become so accustomed to, you forget what it feels like to be truly light, truly free. We think our suffering comes from great, dramatic events, he said, his voice now almost a whisper. But more often, it comes from the accumulated weight of all the small stones we refuse to put down. He gestured to the pile of stones on the ground. The journey to the waterfall was your day. The stones were your worries, your grievances, your regrets. And the moment I gave you permission to let them go, what did you feel? Relief, Kenji whispered. Freedom. Yes, said Ryokan. Freedom. And the most important part of the lesson is this. You do not need my permission. You can choose to put down the stone at any moment. The anger you feel towards someone, you can put it down. The worry about the future, you can put it down. The guilt about the past, you can put it down. Right now, in this very moment. Letting go is not a great, heroic struggle. It is as simple as opening your hand. A profound silence fell over the group, broken only by the roar of the waterfall. The monks looked at the pile of simple gray stones, and they saw them now for what they were. They were not just rocks. They were a teaching made real, a truth felt in their own bones and muscles. The walk back down the mountain was different. The monks walked with a new lightness in their step. Their hands were empty, their minds were spacious. They noticed the deep green of the moss on the trees, the slant of the late afternoon light, the sound of their own footsteps on the path. Their world had opened up again. The prison of the small stone was gone, and in its place was a vast, quiet sense of peace. That evening, as Kenji prepared for sleep, he felt the truth of the lesson settle deep within him. He reviewed his day, not with judgment, but with a gentle awareness. He saw the small stones he had picked up, a flicker of pride during morning chanting, a pang of irritation with a fellow monk, a moment of anxiety about his progress on the path. He had been carrying them all, their subtle weight, creating a tension he hadn't even been aware of.
He imagined himself standing by the waterfall, and one by one, he let the stones drop. He let go of the pride. He let go of the irritation. He let go of the anxiety. He opened the hand of his mind and let them all fall away. A deep physical relaxation spread through his body, starting in his hands and moving through his entire being. He felt his mind become as clear and quiet as the pool at the base of the waterfall. And in that spacious, unburdened stillness, he drifted into the most peaceful sleep he had ever known. The lesson of the stone did not end when the monks returned to the monastery. It became a living practice, a quiet, internal touchstone for their daily lives. In the days and weeks that followed, Kenji began to notice the act of picking up stones everywhere, in himself and in others. He saw it in the dining hall, when an older monk, renowned for his strictness, would scold a novice for a small breach of etiquette. Kenji could almost see the stone of judgment in the old monk's hand, a stone he had been carrying for so long that his hand had curled permanently around it, his knuckles white
with the strain of his own righteousness. The weight of that stone made him unable to taste the simple gift of his food, unable to see the trembling fear in the young novice's eyes. He was a prisoner of his own harsh standards. He saw it in the gardens, where two monks were responsible for tending the raked sand. One monk, after creating a perfect wave-like pattern, would become agitated and angry every time a breeze scattered a few fallen leaves onto his pristine work. He would rush to fix the imperfection, his brow furrowed with anxiety. His stone was the stone of perfectionism, of attachment to a specific outcome. It was a heavy stone, for the world is never perfect, and the wind will always blow. He was in a constant, exhausting battle with reality itself. The other monk, however, would simply watch the leaves fall, and when the time was right, he would gently sweep them away with a calm, accepting smile, his hand and mind remaining open and light. Most importantly, Kenji began to notice it in himself, with a new, non-judgmental clarity. He would be in the middle of chanting, and his mind would drift to a mistake he had made the day before. In that moment, he could feel the subtle, familiar act of closing his hand around the stone of regret. It was a small, almost imperceptible tensing in his mind, but now, because of the journey to the waterfall, he could recognize it. He could feel its weight, the way it immediately pulled his attention away from the present moment, the way it subtly soured his experience. And then he would remember Ryokan's words. You can choose to put it down. In his mind's eye, he would see his hand clenched around the stone, and with a gentle, conscious act of will, he would practice opening it. He would let the stone of regret fall away. He would not argue with the thought, or try to justify his past actions, or berate himself for picking up the stone in the first place. He would simply let it go. And in the moment of its release, he would feel a subtle but immediate lightness, a return to the spaciousness of the present. His attention would come back to the sound of the chanting, to the feel of the air on his skin, to the simple, unburdened reality of the moment. This became his most profound practice. It was not something he did only on the meditation cushion. It was a practice for every moment of the day. When a brother monk was praised by the master and Kenji felt a pang of jealousy, he would recognize the stone and practice opening his hand. When he felt a surge of anxiety about an upcoming interview with the master, he would feel the weight of that stone and practice letting it fall. He learned that some stones were harder to drop than others. The small, daily irritations were relatively easy, but some stones were older, heavier, worn smooth by years of being carried. The stone of his deep-seated fear of not being good enough, the stone of a childhood hurt he had never resolved, these were lodged deep in his palm. Opening his hand around them required more courage, more patience. Sometimes he would let one go, only to find he had unconsciously picked it up again a few moments later. But he did not despair. The path was not about achieving a permanent state of empty-handedness. It was about the gentle, persistent, and compassionate practice of letting go, again and again and again. Each time he let go, even for a second, it was a moment of freedom, a breath of fresh air for the soul. And with each release, his grip on the stones became a little weaker, and his natural state of open-handed peace became a little stronger, a little more familiar. It was the slow, steady path to true and lasting relaxation. Part 8. The Sound of One Hand. In the crisp mountain air of a monastery named Shorin-ji, the great master Hakuin was a storm. He was not a gentle stream like Ryokan, but a force of nature, a whirlwind of energy whose shouts in the meditation hall were said to shake the dust from the rafters. His teaching was fierce, direct, and uncompromising. He believed that the mind, trapped in its cage of logic and habit, needed a great shock to awaken it, a thunderclap to shatter the illusion of a separate self. His tool for this was the koan. A koan is not a riddle to be solved, but a question to be inhabited. It is a spiritual probe designed to push the rational mind to its absolute limit and then force it to break. It is a doorway that cannot be opened with the key of intellect, but only by letting go of the key, the door, and the one who is trying to open it. And Hakuin's most famous, most formidable koan was this: "Two hands clap, and there is a sound. What is the sound of one hand?" Into this demanding world came a young monk named Eshin. He was brilliant, earnest, and possessed a mind as sharp and finely honed as a samurai's sword. He had come to Zen from a background of scholarly study, and he believed, with the quiet confidence of the intellectually gifted, that any problem could be solved through rigorous thought and deep analysis. He saw the koan as the ultimate philosophical puzzle, and he was determined to solve it, to present the master with an answer so perfect, so irrefutable, that his enlightenment would be assured. Hakuin gave him the koan. "What is the sound of one hand?" he asked, his eyes boring into Eshin, seeming to see every corner of the young monk's proud and orderly mind. "Go. Do not return until you have heard it." Eshin bowed and returned to his small room, his mind already buzzing with possibilities. He was excited. This was the great work. He sat in the formal meditation posture, closed his eyes, and began to think. Two hands make a sound by striking each other. The sound is the result of an interaction, of duality. Therefore, the sound of one hand must be a sound that exists without interaction, a sound that is non-dual. What could that be? His mind, a well-trained instrument, began to generate answers. Perhaps it is the sound of the wind in the pine trees. That is a sound made not by two things striking, but by one thing, the air, moving. He felt a surge of intellectual pleasure. It was an elegant answer. He spent the rest of the day refining this idea, preparing his presentation to the master. The next morning he went for his interview. He entered Hakuin's room, his heart beating with a mixture of nervousness and pride. He bowed, and Hakuin grunted, Well, have you heard it? Yes, Master, Eshin said, his voice clear and confident. The sound of one hand is the sound of the wind sighing through the pines. Hakuin's expression did not change. He simply picked up a small iron fan that lay beside him and, with a flick of his wrist, struck Eshin sharply on the shoulder. "No!" he roared, his voice a thunderclap. "That is the sound of the wind, not the sound of one hand. You have brought me a dead idea from a book. Go back. Listen." Eshin stumbled out of the room, his shoulders stinging, his mind reeling with shock and humiliation. His perfect, elegant answer had been dismissed as worthless. The sting of the fan was nothing compared to the sting to his pride. But he was not defeated. He was a scholar. If one theory was wrong, he would simply find another. He returned to his room and sat again. The wind in the pines was too poetic, too external. The sound must be something more fundamental. He thought about the nature of sound itself, vibrations in the air. Perhaps the sound of one hand was the sound of silence, the absence of vibration. It was a clever, paradoxical answer. The sound is no sound. He was pleased with its philosophical depth. He waited a few days, letting his confidence rebuild. Then he went back to the master. "Master," he said with renewed conviction, "I have listened deeply. The sound of one hand is the profound silence of the universe." Hakuin let out a great, booming laugh that seemed to shake the paper screens. "You fool! That is the sound of nothing. I did not ask you for the sound of nothing. I asked you for the sound of one hand. You are playing with concepts. You are deaf. Go and listen." This time he did not strike Eshin, but his laughter was a harder blow than the fan had been. Eshin left, his face burning with shame. His intellect, his greatest strength, the tool that had served him so well his entire life, was failing him. He felt a flicker of fear, a crack in the foundation of his self-assurance. He threw himself into the koan with a new desperation. He tried every possible answer his mind could construct. He thought of the sound of a flowing river, the cry of a night owl, the buzzing of a fly. Each time he thought he had found the answer, he would go to Hakuin, and each time he would be met with a roar, a blow from the fan, or a dismissive wave of the hand. "That is the sound of water. That is the sound of a bird. You bring me the buzzing of your own confused mind." Weeks turned into months. Eshin grew thin and pale. He barely slept. The koan had become his tormentor. It followed him everywhere. When he ate his rice, he would hear the clicking of the chopsticks and think, 2 sounds. When he walked on the gravel path, he would hear the crunching and think, foot and gravel, 2 things. The world had become a relentless symphony of duality, mocking his inability to find the one. His brilliant mind, once a source of pride, had become a prison. It was a machine that could only produce dualistic answers, answers that involved one thing acting upon another. It could think about non-duality. It could create elegant concepts like the sound of silence, but it could not experience it. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, and he could not think his way out. He began to despair. He felt he was a failure, a fraud. He had come to the monastery to find enlightenment, but all he had found was his own profound limitation. He watched the other monks, the simple ones who were not scholars. the ones who just sat in quiet, patient meditation, and he felt a surge of envy. They were not trying to solve the koan. They were just sitting. Perhaps he was simply not meant for this path. One winter evening, after a particularly harsh rejection from Hakuin, Eshin felt he had reached his end. The master had looked at him with a kind of pity and said, "You are trying to catch the wind in a net of words. Stop thinking. Just listen." Eshin returned to his room, but he could not meditate. His mind was a raging sea of frustration and self-doubt. He felt he was going mad. He stood up and walked out into the cold night. A light snow was falling, each flake a perfect, silent star. He walked aimlessly, his feet taking him to the monastery's large bell tower. He stood beneath the great bronze bell, a dark, silent giant against the snowy sky. He looked at his own hand, pale in the moonlight. One hand. Useless. It could not make a sound. It could not solve the puzzle. His entire being felt like that one hand, striving, reaching, but ultimately powerless and alone. In a gesture of complete and utter surrender, he fell to his knees in the snow. He was finished. He gave up. He let go of the koan, of the master, of his desire for enlightenment, of his identity as a brilliant scholar. He let go of everything. His mind, for the first time in months, became empty. The tireless machine of his intellect ground to a halt. There were no more theories, no more answers, no more questions. There was only the cold snow, the silent bell, and the soft, steady rhythm of his own breathing. He knelt there for a long time, lost in this new, unfamiliar state of simple, thought-free presence. And in that vast, profound silence, he heard it. It was not a sound that came from the outside. It was not a sound that could be described in words. It was not the wind or water or silence. It was the sound of being itself. It was the vibrant, humming, silent sound of the universe experiencing itself through him. It was the sound of his own true nature, the sound that was there before the two hands of subject and object ever clapped. It was the sound of one hand. It was so simple, so obvious, so ever-present, that he had completely missed it in his frantic search for a complicated answer. He had been looking for something to hear with his ears, but this was a sound that was heard with the whole body, with the whole universe. A great, quiet joy washed over him, so deep and powerful it brought tears to his eyes. He began to laugh, a soft, gentle laugh that came from the depths of his belly. He was laughing at his own foolishness, at the absurd and heroic efforts of his own mind to solve a problem that never existed. He had been like a man searching for his own eyes, not realizing he was looking with them the entire time. The next morning, Eshin went to see Hakuin. He walked into the room, and there was a new quality to his presence. The anxious, striving energy was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet stillness. He bowed. Hakuin looked at him, and his fierce expression softened. He saw the change. He did not need to ask the question. He simply nodded. "So," he said, his voice unusually gentle, "you have heard it." Eshin did not offer an answer. He did not say, "It is the sound of being itself," or any other concept. He simply stood there, his presence the answer. He raised one hand, his palm open, and in that simple, silent gesture, the master and the student understood each other completely. The koan was not a question to be answered, but a state to be realized. To let go of the logical mind is to enter this state of profound peace. Our minds are like Eshin's. brilliant, tireless machines that are constantly trying to solve the problems of our lives. We analyze our anxieties, we formulate strategies to find happiness, we create complex stories about our past and our future. We are always clapping two hands together, the hand of ourself and the hand of our problems, and living in the noisy result of that collision. The sound of one hand is the peace that is always present when we stop clapping. It is the stillness that underlies all the noise. It is the quiet joy of simply being, without the need to solve, to fix, or to understand. To prepare for sleep is to practice this. It is to give up the struggle, to let go of the day's koans, the unsolved problems and the unanswered questions. It is to allow the brilliant, problem-solving mind to finally fall silent. And in that silence, we can hear it, the soft, humming, peaceful sound of our own being, the perfect lullaby to carry us into a deep and dreamless rest. We let go of the search for an answer, and in doing so, we become the answer itself. Eshen's life in the monastery was transformed. The fierce, desperate striving was gone, replaced by a simple, flowing grace. He still engaged in all the same activities, the morning chants, the work in the gardens, the long hours of meditation, but he did them in a new way. Before, each action had been a means to an end, a step on the ladder toward the goal of enlightenment. Now, each action was complete in itself. The sound of one hand was in the sweeping of the leaves, in the chopping of the wood, in the grinding of the ink for calligraphy. He no longer saw the world as a series of problems to be solved. He saw it as a seamless whole, a continuous unfolding. The distinction between himself and the world, which had once been so sharp and clear, had become soft and permeable. When he listened to the wind in the pines now, he did not think, "That is the sound of the wind." He simply became the listening. There was no Eshen hearing a sound. There was only hearing. The two hands of subject and object had merged into one. This did not mean his mind was always empty. Thoughts still arose. The old habits of analysis and judgment would still occasionally surface, like bubbles rising from the bottom of a deep lake. But they no longer had the same power over him. He could watch them rise and pop without getting caught in their story. They were no longer the frantic activity of a mind trying to solve a puzzle, but simply the natural, harmless energy of a mind at rest. He had found the deep, silent water beneath the surface disturbances. His relationship with Master Hakuin also changed. The interviews were no longer terrifying tests of his intellect. They became a kind of silent dance, a deep communion that went beyond words. Hakuin would give him other koans, even more difficult and paradoxical than the first. "What was your original face, before your parents were born?" A monk asked Joshu, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" Joshu answered, "Mu." "What is Mu?" Eshen would receive these koans not as problems to be solved, but as invitations to sink even more deeply into the thought-free state he had discovered. He would sit with them, not thinking about them, but letting them wash over him, letting them dissolve the remaining traces of his logical, dualistic mind. He would bring his answers to Hakuin, not as verbal formulations, but as gestures, as silences, as a quality of presence. He might answer the koan about his original face by simply getting up and pouring the master a cup of tea. And Hakuin would see the deep understanding in the simple, direct, unself-conscious action, and would grunt in approval. Eshen learned that letting go of the intellect was not a rejection of intelligence. It was an awakening to a deeper, more intuitive form of intelligence, a wisdom that is not learned from books, but arises from the silent ground of being. His old scholarly knowledge was still there, but it was no longer his master. It was now a useful tool that he could pick up and use when needed, and then set down again without being identified with it. He could still engage in philosophical discussion, but he did so with a new lightness, a playful quality, knowing that the words were just fingers pointing at the moon, not the moon itself. He began to understand the master's fierce methods. Hakuin's shouts and blows were not acts of anger, but acts of compassion. They were skillful means designed to short-circuit the thinking mind, to knock the student off the well-worn path of their own habits. The rational mind is a stubborn tyrant. It clings to its power, its sense of control. It will not abdicate its throne willingly. Sometimes it needs a great shock, a sudden, unexpected blow to create a crack in its fortress, allowing the light of a different kind of knowing to shine through. Hakuin was a master physician, administering a harsh but necessary medicine to cure the deep sickness of conceptual thought. The other monks, who had once been intimidated by Eshin's sharp intellect and then perplexed by his long struggle, now began to seek him out. They were drawn to his quiet, unassuming presence. They would ask him for guidance, and he would not offer them clever answers or philosophical theories. He would simply sit with them, share a cup of tea, and in his own profound stillness, they would find a reflection of the peace they were seeking in themselves. He taught them, without teaching, that the goal was not to acquire something new, but to let go of the mental noise that obscures what is already there. The sound of one hand is the sound of our own intrinsic wholeness. The world of two hands is the world of separation, me and you, this and that, success and failure, good and bad. We live our lives in this world of duality, and it is a world of constant effort and friction. We are always trying to bring the two hands together in a way that produces a pleasant sound, the clap of success, of approval, of love. And we are always trying to avoid the painful sound of their collision, the clap of failure, of rejection, of loss. Our lives are a noisy, anxious, and ultimately exhausting performance. To let go is to simply stop clapping. It is to rest in the awareness that is prior to this division. It is to discover the silent, peaceful space of the one hand. This is not a state of blankness or emptiness in a negative sense. It is a state of fullness, of quiet vibrancy, of being so completely one with the moment that there is no room for a separate self to exist. As we lie on the threshold of sleep, the day's performance is over. The audience has gone home. There is no one left to applaud or to criticize. We can finally let our two tired hands fall to our sides. We can let go of the hand of me, with all its stories, its worries, and its ambitions. And we can let go of the hand of the world, with all its demands, its challenges, and its opportunities. We can release the deep, habitual tension of holding them apart, of trying to manage their relationship. We can simply allow them to dissolve back into the silence from which they arose. And in that silence, we can finally hear it, the soft, continuous, peaceful hum of our own being. The sound of one hand, the sound of deep, healing rest. Part 9. No water, no moon. The old nun, Chiono, was a seeker of formidable will. For 30 years, she had pursued enlightenment with the relentless determination of a river carving its way through stone. She had studied under the greatest masters of her time. She had mastered the most difficult scriptures, and she had sat in meditation for countless hours, her back straight, her mind focused, her spirit a taut bowstring pulled back and ready to release its arrow. Yet, for all her effort, the final, liberating insight eluded her. She felt she was standing before a paper screen, so thin she could almost see the light on the other side, but she could not find the way to break through. Her mind was a polished mirror, capable of reflecting the teachings with perfect clarity, but she knew, with a deep and frustrating certainty, that the reflection was not the reality. The moon in the water is not the moon in the sky. Her final master, a man of profound and subtle wisdom, had given her a koan that seemed to be the very essence of her struggle. He had simply pointed to a bucket of water in the temple courtyard and said, "When there is no water, there is no moon. When there is no self, there is no Buddha. Ponder this." Chiono wrestled with this koan for years. She understood it intellectually, of course. The moon's reflection can only appear when there is a still surface of water to receive it. Similarly, the radiant light of our true nature, our Buddha nature, can only be perceived when the turbulent waters of the ego, the sense of a separate, solid self, have become calm and still. To find the Buddha, one must lose the self. She understood the concept, but she could not make it real. Her efforts to lose the self only seemed to strengthen it. The more she tried to be humble, the more she was aware of a self that was trying to be humble. The more she tried to dissolve her ego through rigorous meditation, the more she was aware of a self that was meditating, a spiritual achiever striving for a goal. Her very effort, her 30 years of dedicated practice, had inadvertently built a strong, polished, and very subtle spiritual ego. She was the great seeker, Chiono, on the verge of enlightenment. And as long as that Chiono existed, the final breakthrough was impossible. She was trapped by the very identity she had created in her quest for freedom. She grew old in this struggle. Her hair turned to snow, and her face became a landscape of fine, deep lines. Her youthful fire had mellowed into a quiet, persistent ache of longing. She had done everything she had been told to do. She had followed the path with unwavering devotion. Why was the final gate still closed to her? One night, a night like any other, she was performing her usual evening duties. The moon was full, a perfect silver disk in the clear black sky. It cast a brilliant, silent light over the monastery, making the familiar shapes of the temple buildings and the ancient pine trees seem new and mysterious. Chiono's task was to carry water from the well to fill the large wooden bathtubs for the morning ablutions. She went to the well, her movements slow and practiced, the routine of 1,000 nights. She lowered the old wooden bucket, its bamboo handle worn smooth by the hands of generations of monks and nuns. She felt the familiar jolt as it hit the water, the satisfying weight as she drew it up, hand over hand. The bucket was old, its bamboo bindings weakened by time and constant use, but Chiono did not notice. Her mind was, as always, on her quest. As she carried the heavy bucket, full to the brim, across the moonlit courtyard, she saw the moon reflected in the water. It was a perfect, shimmering circle, a celestial jewel held in the dark wooden vessel. She stopped and gazed at it, her heart filled with a familiar mix of beauty and sorrow. "There it is," she thought, "the reflection. So beautiful, so clear. But it is not the real moon. My mind is like this water, holding a perfect reflection of the teachings, but it is not the real thing. How do I break the bucket of the self so that the water and the moon are gone and only the true moon in the sky remains? She stood there, lost in her deep philosophical contemplation, her body a statue in the moonlight, her mind wrestling with the great problem of her life. She was so absorbed in her thoughts about the bucket, the water, and the moon that she was completely unaware of the reality of the situation, the old, frayed bamboo bindings of the bucket she was holding. And then, in an instant, it happened. With a sudden, sharp crack, the bamboo bindings gave way. The bottom of the bucket fell out. The water, in a single, swift rush, poured out onto the ground, disappearing into the thirsty gravel of the courtyard. And with the water, the reflection of the moon was gone. Chiono was left standing in the moonlight, holding a useless, empty frame, the ghost of a bucket. Her feet were wet, the ground was dark with spilled water, and the moon she had been contemplating was gone. In that moment of sudden, unexpected loss, something broke in Chiono's mind. The 30 years of striving, the intellectual understanding, the spiritual ambition, the very identity of Chiono the Seeker, it all fell away, just as the bottom had fallen out of the bucket. Her mind, for the first time, became completely empty. There was no bucket. There was no water. There was no reflection. There was no Chiono contemplating the reflection. And in that profound, thought-free emptiness, she looked up. She saw the moon. Not the reflection in the water, but the real moon, hanging in the vast, silent, empty sky. It was not a concept. It was not a symbol. It was just the moon, luminous and serene, in a way she had never truly seen it before. And in that seeing, she understood. The moon had always been there. It had never been in the water. Her entire struggle had been focused on the reflection. She had spent 30 years polishing the water, trying to perfect the reflection, trying to understand the relationship between the water and the moon, when all she ever had to do was look up. The breaking of the bucket was not a disaster. It was a liberation. It was an accident, a moment of grace that accomplished what 30 years of effort could not. It shattered the framework of her seeking, the vessel of her ego, and forced her to confront the simple, direct reality that had been present all along. A great, silent laugh began to well up from the depths of her being. She had been trying to lose the self through her own effort, but the self cannot lose the self. It is an impossible task, like trying to bite your own teeth. The self can only be lost when it is forgotten, when the vessel that contains it unexpectedly breaks. She stood there for a long time, her old body drenched in moonlight, her heart overflowing with a quiet, boundless joy. The search was over. The paper screen had not been broken through. It had simply dissolved, revealing that there was never a wall there to begin with. Later that night, she wrote a poem. With this and that, I tried to keep the bucket together, and then the bottom fell out. Where the water does not collect, the moon does not dwell. This story is a deep and gentle lesson on the nature of letting go. We are all Chiono. We all carry a bucket, the bucket of ourself, our identity. It is made of our memories, our beliefs, our roles in life, our stories about who we are. And within this bucket, we carry the water of our consciousness, our moment-to-moment experience. And in this water, we see the reflections of reality. We see the reflection of happiness, the reflection of love, the reflection of peace, and we become obsessed with these reflections. We spend our lives trying to keep the water still, trying to make the reflections clearer and more perfect. We believe that if we can just perfect the reflection of happiness, we will be happy. We are constantly adjusting the bucket, polishing the water, and in doing so, we reinforce the very structure of the self that separates us from the real thing. We try to let go through effort. We tell ourselves, I must let go of my anxiety. But the I, who is trying to let go, is the very source of the anxiety. The effort to release becomes just another form of holding on, a subtle reinforcement of the self who is in control, the self who is managing its own spiritual project. Chiono's awakening came not through effort, but through grace, through an accident. The bottom fell out. And this is the nature of true letting go. It is not something we do, but something we allow to happen. It is a surrender, a collapse of our project of self-improvement. As we prepare for sleep, we are invited to have our own Chiono moment. The day is over. Our efforts are done. We have been carrying our bucket all day, trying to keep the water from spilling, trying to arrange the reflections just right. It is exhausting work. Sleep is the great nightly breaking of the bucket. It is a moment when the structure of the ego is meant to dissolve. But often we resist. We carry our bucket with us to bed. We lie in the dark, still staring at the reflections of the day's events, the worries about tomorrow. We are afraid that if the bottom falls out, if we let go of our thoughts, our plans, our very sense of who we are, then everything will be lost. But Chiono's story teaches us the opposite. When the bucket breaks, nothing of value is lost. Only the illusion is lost. The water of our frantic thinking disappears, and with it the shimmering, distracting reflections. And what is left? The real moon. The vast, silent, peaceful sky of our own true nature, which has been there all along, waiting patiently for us to simply look up. So, as you lie here now, feel the old, tired bucket you have been carrying. Feel its familiar weight, the worn handle of your identity. And imagine that the bamboo bindings are beginning to fray. Feel the structure loosening. You do not have to break it. You only have to stop trying so hard to keep it together. Let the bottom fall out. Let the water of your thoughts pour out and disappear into the ground. Let the reflections of the day vanish. And in the empty, silent space that remains, simply rest. Look up. The moon is here. The peace you seek is not a reflection to be captured in the water of the mind. It is the vast, quiet, luminous sky of your own being. Where there is no water, there is no moon to worry about. There is only peace. There is only rest. After her awakening, Chiono's presence in the monastery became a silent teaching. The other nuns, who had known her for years as the stern, striving, and perpetually dissatisfied seeker, now saw a completely different woman. The tension was gone from her face, replaced by a soft, luminous serenity. Her movements, once so deliberate and purposeful, were now fluid and natural, like water flowing around stones. She still performed her duties, but without the air of grim determination. She carried the water, swept the paths, and chanted the sutras with a simple, quiet joy that was deeply infectious. She rarely spoke of her experience. When a young nun, full of her own spiritual ambition, asked Chiono what she had done to finally achieve enlightenment, Chiono simply smiled and pointed to the new bucket she was using. "The old one broke," she said. This was her only explanation. The young nun, expecting a complex discourse on the nature of emptiness, was bewildered. But the answer was perfect. Enlightenment was not something Chiono had achieved. It was something that had happened to her when her own efforts finally failed. It was an undoing, not a doing. Let's look more closely at the bucket. What are the bamboo bindings that hold it together? They are our stories. The primary story is that there is a solid, continuous me at the center of our experience. This me is the hero of our life's movie. It has a past, which it cherishes or regrets, and a future, which it hopes for or fears. It has a collection of attributes. I am a kind person. I am not good at math. I am a spiritual seeker. I am an anxious person. These stories, repeated to ourselves thousands of times a day, are the bindings that give the bucket its shape and its seeming solidity. We spend so much of our energy maintaining this bucket. When someone criticizes us, we feel a jolt, as if the bucket has been knocked. We rush to repair it, to reinforce the bindings with defensive thoughts. They don't understand me. I am right. They are wrong. When we fail at something, a crack appears in the story of, I am a competent person. We quickly patch it with excuses or by blaming others. Our inner life is a constant, exhausting project of bucket maintenance. Chiono's 30 years of practice, in a subtle way, were a form of very advanced bucket maintenance. She was trying to create the perfect bucket, a spiritual bucket, one worthy of holding the reflection of the moon. She was reinforcing the bindings with stories like, I am a dedicated practitioner. I am getting closer to my goal. I understand the teachings better than others. The more she polished her spiritual identity, the stronger the bucket became, and the more trapped she was. The breaking of the bucket is a moment of cognitive collapse. It's the moment when our stories are revealed as just that, stories. It is not an intellectual realization. It is a direct, visceral experience. For Chiono, the physical breaking of the wooden bucket was the external trigger for the internal collapse of the bucket of self. The sudden, unexpected event bypassed her thinking mind. There was no time to create a story about what was happening. There was only the raw, unmediated experience. The crack, the rush of water, the sudden emptiness in her hands. In that gap, before the mind could rush in and say, "Oh, I've dropped the water, I am so clumsy, now I have to go back to the well," there was a moment of pure, open awareness. In that moment, there was no Chiono. There was only seeing, hearing, feeling. And in that selfless moment, she could finally see the real moon. We all have these bottom falling out moments in our lives, though we usually don't recognize them as opportunities for awakening. It can be a sudden loss, a diagnosis, a moment of failure, or even a moment of profound, unexpected beauty. These are moments when our familiar stories and our sense of control are shattered. Our first instinct is to panic and immediately start trying to rebuild the bucket, to make sense of what happened, to regain our footing. We see the breaking as a disaster. But the Zen path invites us to see these moments differently, to see them as moments of grace. They are precious opportunities to glimpse the reality that lies beyond our self-constructed world. They are cracks in the prison wall of the ego. To prepare for sleep is to consciously create a small, safe space for the bucket to break. The day's work of maintaining our identity is done. We can, for a little while, Let go of the stories. You are not your job title. You are not your role as a parent or a child. You are not your successes or your failures. You are not your anxieties or your hopes. These are just the bamboo bindings. As you lie in the quiet dark, you can allow them to loosen. You can let the story of me become soft and transparent. Imagine the water of your thoughts, the busy, churning contents of your mind. You don't have to force it to be still. That is just more effort, more bucket maintenance. Instead, simply allow the bottom to fall out. Let the thoughts drain away. Don't follow them. Don't analyze them. Just let them go, like water sinking into the ground. What is left? An empty frame, an open space. And in this space, you can look up. You can rest your awareness on the vast, silent, peaceful presence that is always here, just beyond the chatter of your mind. This is the real moon. It is not something you need to achieve or acquire. It has been shining in the sky of your being all along. You have just been too busy staring at its reflection in a bucket of turbulent water. Chiono's poem is the final instruction. Where the water does not collect, the moon does not dwell. This means that when the mind is no longer a container, a bucket trying to hold and possess experience, then the problem of the reflection, the problem of seeking a perfect, lasting happiness within the confines of the self, simply dissolves. There is no longer a me trying to find peace. There is only peace. In this empty, open state, the mind finds its true rest, a sleep as deep and boundless as the night sky itself. Part 10. The wild geese leave no trace. The autumn air was sharp and clear, carrying the faint, sweet scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. In the middle of a vast, still lake, a small boat drifted. In the boat sat an old master, Zengetsu, and his young disciple, a monk named Shida. They were not fishing, nor were they rowing toward any destination. They were simply being, floating in the center of a perfect, unbroken silence. The lake was a flawless mirror. It held the deep, impossible blue of the autumn sky, the fiery reds and golds of the maple trees on the distant shore, and the solemn, dark green of the ancient pines. The reflection was so perfect, but it was difficult to tell where the world ended and its image began. To look down into the water was to look up into another sky. Shida, the young monk, was in a state of quiet turmoil. He had been practicing for many years, and he had attained a certain degree of calm. He could sit for long hours in meditation, and he understood the core tenets of the teachings. But his peace was a fragile thing. He was still caught in the habit of leaving tracks. His mind was like a soft, muddy path. Every event, every thought, every emotion left an imprint. A harsh word from a senior monk would leave a deep, resentful footprint that he would circle back to again and again. A moment of praise from the master would leave a proud, happy track that he would try to preserve, to hold on to. His meditations were often a review of these tracks, analyzing them, judging them, trying to smooth them over or deepen them. He was burdened by the weight of his own history, even the history of the last 5 minutes. He longed for the freedom of a mind that was fresh, new, and unmarked in every moment. He had spoken of this to Zengetsu, and the master, in his typical enigmatic way, had said nothing. He had simply motioned for Shida to follow him to the boat, and so they sat in the middle of the lake, in a silence that was becoming increasingly heavy for the young monk. He felt he was being tested, and he did not know the question. As the sun began to dip toward the western mountains, a sound broke the stillness. It was a distant, lonely cry from high in the sky. They both looked up. A long, graceful V formation of wild geese was flying south for the winter. They were magnificent, their wings beating in a slow, powerful rhythm, their forms silhouetted against the deepening orange of the sky. They flew directly over the lake. As they passed overhead, their perfect, dark reflections passed over the boat, journeying across the mirrored surface of the water. Shida watched, captivated. He saw the geese in the sky, and he saw the geese in the lake. One was real, the other an illusion. Yet they moved in perfect, silent harmony. It was a moment of sublime, effortless beauty. The geese flew on, their cries fading into the distance until they were just a faint, dark line on the horizon. And then they were gone. The sky was empty again. Shida looked down at the water. The reflections of the geese were also gone. The surface of the lake was once again a perfect, unbroken mirror of the empty sky. There was no sign that the geese had ever been there. No feather had fallen. No ripple remained. The water had received the image completely, and it had released it completely. It had left no trace. A profound stillness settled over Shida, a quiet that was deeper than the silence of the lake. He felt he was on the verge of a great understanding. Zengetsu, who had been watching the young monk's face, finally spoke. His voice was soft, yet it seemed to fill the entire world. "Shida," he said, "you have been watching the geese." "Yes, master," Shida replied, his voice a whisper. "The wild geese fly across the sky," Zengetsu said, looking up at the empty blue. "Their image is reflected on the water." He paused, then looked directly into Shida's eyes. "The geese do not intend to cast their reflection. The water has no mind to receive it." The words were simple, but they landed in Shida's heart with the force of a temple bell. He understood. The geese were just being geese. They were flying south, following an ancient inner command. They were not performing for the lake. They were not trying to create a beautiful image. They were simply living their goose nature, completely and utterly in that moment. And the water was just being water. It was not trying to capture the image of the geese. It was not clinging to the reflection, thinking, "How beautiful, I must hold on to this." Nor was it rejecting the image, thinking, "This disturbs my perfect stillness." It simply received the reflection without judgment, without attachment, and then, when the geese had passed, it let it go, without regret, without a trace. The entire event was a seamless, egoless dance. There was no intention and no retention. There was only the pure, unmediated happening of the moment. Shida looked at his own mind, at the muddy path of his thoughts. He saw how different it was from the water. When an event happened, the flight of the geese, his mind would immediately grasp it. It would think, "That was beautiful." That thought would leave a track. Then another thought would follow. "I wish I could feel that way all the time." Another track. Then a memory would arise. "This reminds me of a time in my childhood." A deeper track. Soon, the simple, direct experience of the geese flying overhead was completely obscured by a messy network of tracks, of concepts, memories, desires, and regrets. His mind was not a clear mirror, but a cluttered scrapbook. He was always trying to manage the reflections. He was trying to hold on to the pleasant ones and erase the unpleasant ones. He was living in a world of traces, of ghosts, of the past. He was never truly present for the flight itself, because he was too busy thinking about it. The master's words echoed in him. The water has no mind to receive it. This was the key.
The water's clarity came from its no mind, its lack of a grasping, judging, story-making self. It was a state of pure, open, receptive awareness. It did not add anything to the experience, and it did not take anything away. This, Sheeta realized, was true freedom. It was not a matter of smoothing over the tracks in the mud. It was a matter of becoming water, of realizing the mind's true nature, which is like a mirror. The mind's nature is not to be permanently empty of reflections. Thoughts, feelings, and sensations will always fly across it like geese.
The practice is not to stop the geese from flying. The practice is to allow them to pass without leaving a trace. To live this way is to be fully present for each moment of life. When joy flies over, you experience it completely, its reflection clear and bright in the water of your mind. But you do not try to hold on to it. When it passes, you let it go, and the mind returns to its natural, peaceful clarity. When sorrow flies over, you allow that reflection as well. You feel it fully, without resistance, without creating stories about it. You do not add the tracks of, "This is terrible, this should not be happening." You simply allow the dark wings to pass. And when they are gone, they are gone. They leave no stain, no scar. This is the ultimate act of letting go. It is not a single event, but a continuous, moment-by-moment release. It is the end of the project of accumulating experience, of building a self out of the traces of the past. It is to be reborn in every moment, your mind as fresh and clear as the surface of the lake after the geese have flown. Shida bowed his head, a deep and grateful bow. He did not need to say anything. Zengetsu saw the understanding in his eyes. The young monk's face, which had been tight with striving, had softened. A new kind of stillness had settled over him, the stillness of the water, not the stillness of ice. It was a living, receptive peace. The master picked up the oars. The sun had set, and a pale sliver of moon was rising in the east. As he began to row them back to shore, the oars dipped into the water, creating soft, spreading ripples. The perfect reflection was disturbed. Shida watched the ripples, but he did not cling to the memory of the perfect stillness. The ripples were now the reality of the moment. He watched as they spread out and slowly faded, the water gradually returning to its mirror-like calm. He saw that even the disturbance of the oars left no lasting trace. It was all part of the same seamless, flowing reality. As we prepare for the great letting go of sleep, this story is our final guide. Our day has been like the flight of many birds across the sky of our awareness. There have been the bright, swift birds of happy moments, the slow, heavy birds of difficult tasks, the dark, flapping birds of worry and fear. They have all crossed the sky of our mind, and they have all cast their reflections in the water of our consciousness. Now the day is over. The sky is growing dark and empty. But are we still holding on to the reflections? Are we replaying the conversations of the day, tracing the tracks of our successes and failures? Are we staring at the lingering image of an unpleasant encounter, or trying to cling to the fading reflection of a moment of pleasure? If we do, we carry the day's turmoil with us into the night. Our mind is not a clear mirror, but a disturbed and murky pool, unable to find rest. The invitation of sleep is the invitation to become like the water. Let it all go. The geese have flown. They are gone. They were just reflections, and their time is past. The geese do not intend to be remembered. The water has no mind to hold on to them. Let go of the praise you received. It was a beautiful reflection, but it has passed. Let it leave no trace of pride. Let go of the criticism you endured. It was a dark reflection, but it too has passed. Let it leave no trace of resentment. Let go of the tasks you completed and the ones you left undone. They are geese that have flown, or geese that will fly tomorrow. They have no place in the quiet sky of this present moment. Feel your mind becoming as vast, still, and clear as that autumn lake. It is your true nature. It is not something you have to create or achieve. You only have to stop disturbing it with the grasping of your thoughts. Allow every final thought, every lingering feeling, every last trace of the day to dissolve, leaving no ripple, no stain. There is only the quiet, the darkness, the gentle rhythm of your own breath. The sky is empty. The water is still. There is no intention and no retention. In this profound, trace-free peace, the mind finds its ultimate release, its deepest healing. This is the entrance to a sleep that is not just a pause between days, but a true returning to the source, a deep and dreamless rest